Yeah, so I guess this is the first time that we're all seeing each other together. We have Bruce, Ario at the bottom screen. We have Susie at the bottom, and we have Dan, and we have me. I mean, today we just want to talk about just kind of the state of healthcare in the United States. We've all had varying experiences with the healthcare system, some worse than others. But before we even get to that, just kind of like recent events in Texas. Dan Schneider's from Texas. Can you talk about a little bit about what's been happening? I mean, to my understanding, it's kind of the same old generic thing, right? Where you have like a bunch of power companies. It doesn't matter what the number is, right? You could have a handful, you could have many, many. The result always seems to be the same. We have tons of energy companies in New York City here, but similar problems, right? You just have people that are not willing to put in the money, right, to pay for infrastructure and to prepare for all these like worst case eventualities, which do, of course, eventually come. So, an insider's look, Dan, like what's been happening the last few weeks there?
Well, we had a snowstorm of about between 3 and 7 inches, and it's the typical lack of government preparation, which is similar to healthcare. I mean, just in brief, here in Texas, Bruce is up in Minnesota. I lived in Minnesota for a dozen years, where I met him and we were in the UPG, the Uptown Poetry Group, for many years. Here it paralyzed them because these idiots, they didn't winterize their power plants. They didn't winterize the turbines of wind. In Western Texas, they have thousands of windmills that supply power for the western quarter of the state. They didn't figure on that. And the end result was you had frozen pipes. Like we were out of water for about a week, Jessica and I. We had intermittent electricity for 4.5, 5 days, which was better than most people. But it was typical. They have in Texas something called ERCOT, which is Economic Resource Council of Texas, I think is what it, or no, Energy Resource Council of Texas. And they had people, a dozen people or so on this board. And basically what they did in the late 80s was they deregulated and removed Texas from the national power grid so that local providers could charge higher prices if they wanted to. So you had a few companies in Dallas, for example. One was called Griddy, GRIDDY, that apparently was charging people like $6,000 a day for energy, because for a megawatt hour went to something like $9,000 per hour when it was down around $25 an hour because of need. And so anyway, that basically was just trying to take advantage of it. And of course, I remember I told Jessica and a few other people that I worked with because I missed 4 days of work because the roads were unplowed, and I live in what's called the hill country, and you can't go up and down hills if they're all icy or with snow unremoved. And they tried to then overcharge everything. It was a mess. And eventually most of the people on ERCOT were forced to resign or fired. Some of them weren't even in Texas. The idiot governor that we have here, this guy named Abbott, he who approved this along with people for 30 years, they knew this was coming. There were reports for every few years in Texas that there could be a real crisis if this ever happened, but they wait till the last minute. And it was declared a disaster, but it was not really a natural disaster. It was a disaster from lack of preparation by people who knew better, but actually wanted to make money on it. The guy who owns the Dallas Cowboys, Jerry Jones, that bastard, he made $1 billion in just a few days off of his investments in some of these energy companies. And now they've thrown these stooges from ERCOT and a few other power companies. I think they're suing the company Griddy to get it off. They're suing them out of oblivion. But it's just these people covering up their own asses because, for example, the former Texas governor, Rick Perry, who was between this idiot Abbott and George W. Bush when he was governor, he was another one who made mint in this crisis. And then that idiot Ted Cruz went to Cancun because his daughters wanted to go to Cancun.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was just a shit show and a joke, and it was 99.9% human caused disaster, not because of 3 to 7 inches that fell. Totally unprepared.
One thing I've been wondering about is, I know that the Texas Railroad Commission is supposed to be the thing that regulates oil and gas and stuff like that. What exactly is their kind of relationship with the state and with these companies? Because based on what I was reading, they seem to just kind of allow companies to more or less get away with everything, right? You sometimes have negotiations about what needs to get reported in terms of infrastructure defects, and I mean, they're not actually regulating. So is that just sort of set up as a kind of like way to placate people and make it seem as if there's like some level of regulation, or what? Like, what is its job and what is it not doing?
I don't know the particulars of that, but this is the end game of Reaganism and deregulation and laissez-faire capitalism. And the net result is predictable. It's personally, like I've told you how I lost a job a few years ago because the company I was working for was violating local safety and health laws. I reported them, but in Texas, it's legal for someone who's a whistleblower, as I was, to be fired by the company or the employer that you're blowing the whistle on. So this is just what happens when you have no regulations, no protections for the consumer, for the whistleblower, or for just the average person on the street, even if they don't own a home. It's a total cash grab. It's total grabastic capitalism at its worst. Just take what we can and let the rest of the people suffer. And but I mean, I don't know the specifics. Going back with the Texas Railroad Commission, you'd have to go back to the Gilded Age in the 1870s or 80s when that was initially set up. And I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on that.
Yeah. Susie, you have your finger up. I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, that means hi, I'm in the class and I want to make a comment.
Oh, okay.
Number of years ago, I researched solar in Florida, the Sunshine State,
Mm-hmm.
and around the turn of the century. And it was all held in proprietorship by this people floating stuff over our heads. And there was a lot of resistance to spreading that information about solar photovoltaic and the conversion from direct to alternating current, which is what all of our stuff runs on. And it was baffling to me, but it was held in proprietorship. Now, there were people who were trying to live off grid and orchestrating their own batteries, their own solar panels, their own photovoltaic stuff. And it was miserable. At one point you would have, because all the power companies here are, this area is this company, this one's Duke, this one's this one's this one buys from 2 or 3, it's a collective, etc. And they resisted alternative power because you would then be feeding back through the lines. For example, during the 5 hurricanes where we also had natural disaster, this was a while ago, we were running a generator and it was 10 days without power. So we're running a generator so we can do stuff like shower, to go to work, because it was a well. And the neighbor calls and says, shut your generator off, you're feeding back through the line. And some company was trying to fix it 2 miles up the road. So you have this highly historically involved, nuanced, orchestrated resistance to alternative power sources. Now, there's no reason except greed why you can't have photovoltaic on every single municipal building, every school, every government agency, all that, why they can't be at least running themselves with the roof area that they have. There's advances that are mind-blowing. For example, Germany, which has snow runs solar. So these idiotic ideas about, oh, the sun's not out, blah, 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 I mean, were you stoned in science class? I mean, I attended, I didn't cut. So you don't have to be an astrophysicist to figure out that there has been a resistance to this grassroots self-sufficiency. It's expensive, it's difficult. I think Bill Maher's been on TV complaining about how long it's taken for California to flip the switch. It's got everything, 1,000 days or whatever. So Dan's point about it being avoidable is true. However, there's infantile of us to not acknowledge planned deaths, not specific ones, but I mean, they know that there's going to be suffering and they're okay with that. And that is unacceptable. It's just, I mean, I don't know how many people died, and then it becomes intersectional with healthcare and energy, who couldn't access their devices that they needed to live, their breathing machines, various other sorts of things. We've been so disenfranchised that us four little writers representing different parts of the country are trying to wrap our minds around this anguish when there are people, as Dan said, who were driven by the profit margin. They're sociopathology flyover, but we're collateral damage. We're inconvenient peasants, and we're even more inconveniently educated because we read, right? We all, four of us read. So, the intersection of greed for the power companies, for the healthcare agencies, for this whole horrible pandemic that has us all in mortal terror is a way of managing us as a population. I mean, these are things that have been put upon us. Dan cited Reagan. I would cite Eisenhower and his warning about the military-industrial complex. We've got lots of powers here at play, and there are people who are understanding this and sideways with it. They're making, they're hurting their own neighbors rather than saying, you know what, I'm not going to buy this anymore. This company is doing bad things, and you know what, I'll find some other way of getting by with this. We've become such housewives in our Stepfordy shopping idea that we don't think about the fact that we have the power with every penny that we spend. We have the power with what we choose to go along with and what we choose not to participate in. I mean, our silence eventually, if there's enough of it, will be, it affects their profit margin, so they have to do something about it.
No, go ahead, Bruce.
The weather is nice for Minnesota at this time of the year. It's about 35, 40 degrees, I guess. And but I didn't have real knowledge of the power companies up in Minnesota. We have not had the problem that Texas had. I am a customer of an organization called Excel Energy, and it's probably the biggest.
And nuclear, right? And nuclear.
No, right? I opted for the special plan that all my energy comes from wind power.
Oh, okay.
So they got a little bit of each. They do nuclear, I think. Yeah. They also do wind power, which I got, and solar power, and they're I don't have this knowledge that they're a bad company. It's not the word that's going around in Minnesota. Of course, they're profit driven, of course. but they haven't really been particularly abusive. I don't believe they have what we would call a monopoly, at least not technically. Maybe in fact they do, but no, I don't have the problem with my energy company that some of the other folks are having.
Alex, if I could just comment on two things that Susie had mentioned. First was how the weather could cause problems. I'll give you an example. I live in a northern suburb of Austin, and Austin is on the edge of what's called the hill country, which most people think of Texas as flat like Kansas, but the hill country is what's called part of the Permian Basin, an uplift that 20 million years ago was under a shallow sea, but now is about 1,000 feet above sea level. And so anyway, in that hill country, I work in another town that's about 20 miles away. So I have to drive. It's a nice rural drive between two towns, but you have to go up and down these hills. And some of the hills can get steep. And above this this highway called Route 29, I was told that Monday that the storm first hit that there was no way. I was stopped by a Williamson County Sheriff's Department deputy and said that he wasn't going to allow me to travel there because if you went north of 29 into the hill country and your car stopped or got stuck in the snow or fell or skidded off somewhere, there was no way they could get an emergency vehicle to you. Same thing if you were an old lady who had a heart attack or someone who, cut themselves, started a fire with a generator, everything's going to burn down because the emergency vehicles couldn't get to you. So that's one thing how the lack of preparation in that kind of a situation can affect health and whatnot. But the second thing I wanted to mention was Susie had mentioned solar. I have a neighbor, a couple of 2 or 3 doors down from me that has solar on his roof. It's a 2-story home versus my 1-story home. And then I also have a fellow who works in the store that I work in who has solar on his roof. And they were complaining about the fact that Texas, because it's deregulated and because there isn't any statewide standard for connecting, say, the different power companies, and they're off the grid and each one supplies themselves, is that when you have, for example, one of the reasons people get solar is so that they can sell some of the energy to the companies and have a negative bill. But these guys couldn't sell during this storm because sometimes for the first couple of days, the snow and the ice was on top of the solar panels. But even when it was off the solar panels, because these companies were in such a panic and they were running out of juice and they were having planned blackouts, there was no way to connect the things up. So you could not, even if say 50% of Texas had solar energy, because of this asinine patchwork system, you couldn't even get the energy that people were generating from their own solar cells on their own roofs into the system. Mm-hmm. They could perhaps power their own homes. But this is why you need fucking regulation. This is why you need to have people doing this. It's like she had mentioned ACD. Imagine you had half the population just on AC current and everyone and the other half on DC current, but they were a patchwork through out a neighborhood and throughout the system. And then you had other people who were being powered by some other.
Yeah, it used to be that way, right? It used to be that way, and nothing could really get done. I don't have it. I have solar panels in my home. In New York City, it's not as bad as we described, but I remember when I had these installed. I mean, they used to do subsidies, right? They used to have tax breaks and stuff like that for these kinds of installations. The year that I installed them, they cut them off, so I couldn't do anything about that. But it's just it's like this kind of like death by 1,000 cuts, right? Where if you have a kind of dynamic, right, where you don't get enough state subsidies for renewables, you're simply going to get, prices of oil, natural gas, and everything else just kind of going down, right? This is one of the critiques of Obama. Like, people praise Obama for, on the one hand, getting into, the Paris Climate Agreement. But first of all, we know that that's insufficient as it is, right? So far, countries haven't even met 1/10 of their goals. But even if they had, The problem with the Obama administration when it comes to energy is he could speak a good game about renewables, but given the fact that he was into fracking and he just, he opened up so many new energy reserves or just, dirty fuels, that created a price collapse in oil. If you have a capitalist system, right, and it's perfectly legal to use these kinds of energy products, you don't have an incentive for a company or a country to not use this suddenly new cheap oil. So in this kind of weird way, the Obama administration, even if he was personally interested in renewables, he actually expanded, at least in some parts, use of dirty energy, right? Which is why this is part of the reason. Why do countries not hit their targets? It's because there is no incentive, right? The only way you could get an incentive is you need those subsidies. And without that dynamic, everything's going to be dirty fuels, until New York City sinks underwater, right?
Well, but fracking is a totally unnecessary process, but the last few administrations have wanted to wean us off of Mideastern oil, which is not bad. I mean, it's still dirty and it's still going to fuck up the environment. But in a short-term game, if you wean us off Middle East oil, okay, great. But why are we then still involved in the Middle East? Why are we still backing the Saudis and involved in Iraq and Iranian politics? Well, because we want to control them politically. That has nothing to do with energy. It has to do with us still wanting to have a legitimate reason to be there, even though technically we wouldn't. If we went all solar, we could just go back to the way we were in the 19th century, and not be Teddy Roosevelt's cop, on the corner, what was the term, the policeman of the world, I mean, I'm not arguing for that, but it's just so easily seen through as a load of bullshit.
Yeah. Just one more thing. So Susie mentioned about, there is obviously resistance, like locally, grassroots, to these kinds of dynamics, but Texas, so like belly of the beast, like what does that resistance look like? I'm sure you had, even if it's temporary, a bunch of people that are now pissed off over what happened. Are like, what are people blaming? Like, is the propaganda deep enough that people are just blaming renewables? Because I heard that some people were like, what is their response of like ordinary people from Texas to what's been going on? Like, are they talking about regulation finally, or is it too far gone in some ways?
You're talking to me. Texans have the plantation mentality. Texans believe that they should be poor. All Texans believe they're temporarily displaced millionaires. They want the system in place because if they ever get rich, they want to be able to fuck over other people. That's the way Texans are raised. I'm gonna raise steer. Whether it's cattle, whether it's railroads, whether it's oil. That's the Texas motto. And I'm not trying to slander all Texans. I've lived here for 18 years, and Texans can be wonderful. They're a lot more friendly than your typical Minnesotan. Nothing against Bruce. But the whole Minnesota nice thing. But Texans are very friendly. They believe in charities. To me, a charity is a sign of a failed government. Yeah. You should not. If you have a lot, Texans are big on charities. They love Goodwill, which is a terrible employer. Goodwill is an employer right down there with Walmart and Amazon in the way it treats them. But they love Goodwill. So I mean, it's just a pathology. Yes, there are going. Texas is slowly getting quote unquote bluer. But I don't like the Democrats. I voted socialist this year. I voted green for the last 20 years, except for my 2 regrettable votes for Obama. For 30 years, I voted green or other third party. But most Texans won't do that. And it's this pathology. They've never gotten off the plantation.
But where's that anger? I mean, I'm sure some people are angry. Like, where is that directed? Like, what is the conversation that they have?
Poor people, working class people. But in Texas, that doesn't matter. Greg Abbott, the governor, doesn't care about poor people. The Republicans, given a choice, I'd rather deal with Republicans who will say, I just want you to die. I don't care. Give me an honest enemy than a dishonest friend. The Democrats are just as greedy and money hungry. I mean, we're getting off the topic of healthcare, but I mean.
This is an example kind of how healthcare in the United States runs as well. I mean, it's very similar, I find, in many ways, which is why it's like a good way to start. Yeah. And I mean, to transition into healthcare. So, until like the 1940s or so, there was no real kind of, organized sense when it came to healthcare. Although even in 1942, right, it was all kind of, private mediated. FDR during World War II, he had wage controls in place. Companies could not, entice workers with promises of higher wages because of that. So they were like, you know what, let's try to entice people by giving them, healthcare options in, through their employer, right? Which became kind of the standard model that we're with to this day. We had like some pushes towards a nationalized system similar to Bismarck's system in Germany. Bismarck started his system, ironically enough, because he was afraid of socialism coming to Germany. But the way that this was sort of processed in America was nationalized healthcare is socialism. Of course, when the Cold War became a thing, you just had all these Red Scares and red baiting tactics that anytime a nationalized healthcare plan was put forward, even if you had some sort of some level of support, politically, grassroots, and even from some doctors groups, it was always defeated, right? Partly through these kinds of political scares, right? So we've been living with the reality of that, since forever at this point. I guess where I would start is just, before we get to the kind of nitty gritty of like the history of some of the stuff, just so people have like, an into how this feels right for the average person. Does anybody want to start with like their own healthcare insurance experiences, I guess, throughout your lives, whether it's like with an employer, times you've been unemployed, like what has that been like up until this point, I guess?
I'll go ahead on that one. I grew up on my parents' plan when I was a kid, and then I had some employers when I turned when I was in my teenage years, and I started, I think the first actual health insurance I got was through my employer at Radisson Hotels. That lasted for a while until I lost that job. And then I had to buy my own insurance. I bought Blue Cross Blue Shield, and that worked all right. That wasn't too expensive for me. But that lasted for a while. But then I had that bout where I was homeless, and I lost everything, lost my policy, lost everything. And I had a doctor, a psychiatrist that I was under his care. And when I lost my insurance, he dropped me like a lead weight. So then I got back in the system and bought a policy, but there was a pre-existing condition that I had with this diagnosis of schizophrenia. So then I eventually got on a program called Minnesota Comprehensive, and that's the only program that really made sense or would take me. They were expensive, over $1,000 a month.
Oh shit!
But they covered my medications and costs, but they were expensive. And then came Obamacare, and that saved me about $400 a month.
From that $1,000, so you were paying $1,000 still, and then Obama saved you
I was
400?
down around 600. Yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
And just a couple of questions about that. So the fact that you had $1,000 a month that you had to pay,
it was over 1,000. It was like 1,100.
Okay, so that price, which is it's a little bit out of the norm, I'm guessing for some people, was that specifically because the costs for mental health is just much higher, or what?
Yeah, it's called you're familiar with pre-existing conditions. I had a pre-existing condition, and Minnesota Comprehensive was a special policy that was offered to people with pre-existing. because I tended to have high medical costs with my pharmacy, especially, and they would cover me. And the other insurance companies, I can't remember if I could even get insurance through the other companies or that they were so much higher. I don't think that they took me.
Mm-hmm.
The other insurance companies. Minnesota Comprehensive became the most attractive option out there. And Obamacare, like I said, saved me it was at least $400 a month.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I just finished rereading. I first read CITYBOY, your novel. So Bruce Ario wrote a novel called CITYBOY. I first read it about maybe 10 years ago, and I reread it in the last couple of days. I'm not sure to what extent it's based on your life, but there's a character there that works for the IRS. So have you ever, like you had experiences, I'm guessing, working for like the city or the state, right? Were you ever like on a kind of state insurance plan and I'm guessing if you were, that was probably the best one or what?
I don't believe that I had insurance through an employer, with the exception maybe of the Radisson Hotel back when I was in my early 20s. Mm-hmm. The federal government, I don't think I had a policy. I think I bought my own policy, if I remember correctly.
I see.
That would have been back in 1980.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I had my own policy at that time. I'd already had a pre-existing, but it wasn't such that the insurance companies did not gouge people at first on that, but then they started to do that.
Yeah. So we had Obamacare, all the kind of major provisions started going into effect 2013 and then again in 2014. So since that time, so you were at 1,100, you dropped to 600. What's been happening with the premiums since? I mean, like Trump tried to disembowel parts of Obamacare. Have your premiums been going up or what does that look like? Or has it been stable?
Minnesota came up with the marketplace. They called it MSure. Mm-hmm. And you could get a policy, you could shop around for a policy. And my policy, my last payment on my policy, I had a policy with Health Partners. And that was for about $700 a month. Mm-hmm. And most recently, about a year ago, I went on Medicare. And my policy now Medicare costs me $149.50 a month. Mm-hmm. But there's high co-payments for my pharmacy. So I'm not off a whole lot better than when I was spending $700 a month. And with all the expensive medications I got, some of them are not covered that well. And I'm kind of at the mercy with I could try going off my meds, but that hasn't worked in the past. And I'm pretty convinced I need my medications. And so I'm kind of, I'm just doing about the same as I was when I was spending $700 a month on insurance policy that mm-hmm. covered my meds at a higher rate.
Yeah. And I'm guessing that's something that most people don't really think about, right? A lot of people assume when they get on Medicare, it's like, okay, I've lived this long, I'm sort of over the hump. But if you are a person that needs medications, right, prescription pills, that could be a completely different situation.
Yeah,
right?
I was quite surprised about the lack of coverage for certain mm-hmm. medications. I'm on about 3 medications that cost me in excess of $100 a month. Mm-hmm. Before insurance, they would cost my first payment before the insurance kicks in for one medication is $650 mm-hmm. and a month. And so, yeah, I'm just waiting for the medications to go generic and
like, these decisions have absolutely nothing to do with you. Like, I mean, imagine like you're waiting for some fucked up patent, right? That is allowed to exist as long as it exists. You're waiting for that to lapse, right? I mean, you literally have no input into that.
I have a certain enmity against medication. Farmers, the big pharmaceutical companies that charge these exorbitant, just out of this over the top prices for their medication. The greed there. You want to talk about greed, Dan, in Texas with the energy. Try to take a look at what pharmaceutical companies do with their medications, how greedy they are. They say that they spend the cost on R&D, but I can't believe
as they fly around in corporate jets.
Yeah. And more recently, it's been like a stock buybacks, right? If you have nothing to put your money in, why not just artificially inflate the price of your stock? This conversation started actually with Dan, wanted to talk about his experiences in healthcare, especially over the last couple of years. So maybe, Dan, you could share some of that. So what's been happening with you and these various companies over the years?
Well, I mean, just in terms of going back to my childhood, my dad worked as a van driver for the New York City Health Department. And back in the 1960s and 70s, our day-to-day medical expenses were paid for by the New York City Health Insurance Plan called HIP. And in fact, the building was an orange-covered building, very 70s looking, right on Jamaica Avenue, or like 160th, 165th Street, somewhere in there. Then hospital coverage was Blue Cross Blue Shield. And my dad, when he retired in 1978, 78, he would have, or 79, he would have been 62. He retired, and I think he was making like 11,000 at that time, which would probably be about 35, 40,000 today. But when he retired, though, the medical insurance did keep on for me and my sister until we hit 18, and for my mother until I guess for quite a while, because it was part of the pension. And in those days, pensions not only payouts, but if you were in a union, like my dad was in DC District Council 37 union, which was one of the biggest labor unions for the city of New York back then, they also paid for medical insurance up until children reached the age of majority, and for widows for, I guess, until they died. So my mother had that for most of her life. Then I worked in assorted jobs. I've been in 4 unions, and most of their medical benefits, like when I worked for AT&T or for this company called Finest in New York, they had pretty good medical benefits. I'm now currently on my wife's, Jessica's, insurance. She works for a biotech firm, and it's decent, but it's nothing compared to what my dad had years ago. The companies, when I have worked for them, before we were talking, I mentioned I got a hernia now that I'm going to have surgery in a few days. The company I work for, I've worked there 3 years. I've been injured 3 times because of their negligence. First, I had a partly detached retina because I got socked in the eye by something at work, and the company determined it wasn't. They didn't determine it wasn't their fault. I only started showing symptoms of the detached retina 6 months afterwards. And you have to show symptoms within 60 days before they'll consider covering it. So they didn't pay for that and the subsequent surgeries, 2 surgeries on this eye and the surgery on this eye. Then I had a broken foot.
You had to do that out of pocket for the surgeries?
Yeah. And then I had a broken foot. And the only coverage they had was I went to a doctor a couple of times, a real doctor. And the only reason they covered that was because it was actually on video camera and they saw the negligence, which was obvious. And then this hernia, I had a hernia at another company I worked for back in the middle 6 or 7 years ago. And that company was going to pay for it, but they sent me to a doctor who was a total quack. And I said, I'm not letting this idiot cut me open. So they said, well, if I wanted to go to another doctor, I had to pay for that myself. So given the choice of going to a guy I was not comfortable with taking a scalpel to me or paying for myself, I paid for myself. Then the company that I got the hernia just on January 4th this year, this company, the third time, they took about a month to decide that they weren't responsible because, naturally, since I had a hernia with another company on the other side of my body, this somehow was supposed to be related. Of course, it's nonsense, because that's like saying if I broke this hand 10 years ago and I broke this hand last week, they're somehow related. It's totally ridiculous, but that was their way out of that. And the thing is, the company that I work for now should not have any right to look into my medical records, but they would not even think of covering it unless I signed off to let them look at a prior medical record. So this is a way that they hold you hostage and screw you over in that manner. And so now, I'm going to have to pay for this hernia surgery. Hopefully it won't be as painful as the first one, because now they're using a robot to do it. But it's just one of the many ways that they're screwed over. And this company I work for now is the only employer that has never automatically provided disability insurance. When I worked for the other company and had the hernia, I was able to take off 2 weeks and get paid at like 70% with short-term disability. This company doesn't provide they do provide short or long-term disability, but you have to submit to a test. But because I had a broken foot and because I had the eye thing caused by this company, they then use that as saying, well, we're not going to give you short-term disability because you're injury prone, even though it's their negligence that caused the first two things. So very similarly to what I said earlier about the way companies rationalize things, and they'll fire someone if you speak up and you're a whistleblower. If you get injured by a company's negligence, they'll use that as an excuse to keep further medical care from you later on. So that's a short history. Maybe Susie has something. I don't know.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Susie.
I'm a multiply. One of my identifiers is disabled.
Mhm.
All right. Now that becomes a legal term, because how disabled are you? There's a priority system, a hierarchy of disability. And disabled people are then in competition with each other for who's the most fucked up, which is eugenics. There's a lot of eugenics involved in the healthcare system. We've seen that. We've seen that with COVID vaccine rollout. We've seen that with COVID. We have to be stupid not to notice. As a disabled person who has no services, it's you. It's just you. You have to research what you can research. You have to do what it is that you can do to try and survive as best as you can survive. In England with COVID, the disabled people were required to sign do not resuscitates because their lives were considered to be expendable. What we're seeing in COVID is that there are lots of lives that are considered to be expendable. One of the issues with some people who are not in a hurry to get in line for the vaccine is the liability waiver that you have to sign, right? One of the vaccines messes with people who have shellfish allergy, right? So you have to make sure that you don't go into anaphylaxis, as soon as you get the shot. There are a lot of disabled people who cannot tolerate the vaccine. Right? That'll kill them too. So when we're talking about healthcare issues, and I'm glad that you gentlemen represent the population that you do, because so many of us are just like, well, they don't matter. And now it's becoming an economic issue. Are you rich enough to stay alive? Are you rich enough to be valuable enough to be kept alive? And this sort of population control issue, there's other ways of limiting the effect of millions and millions and millions of people on the planet, which is unsustainable, other than causing all of this suffering and needless death. I mean, one of the things that we've read repeatedly about COVID is needless death. I'm in Florida. We have a governor who is not been concerned with public health and safety. That's widely researchable. He's made vaccines available to certain sections of the population geographically regarding donations, etc. So we have these circumstances where our lives are being manipulated in terms of their value. And it's offensive, to say the least. There are people who are living every day in mortal terror. It's not a pleasant feeling to realize that, you stood up as a little kid, said the pledge, believed like you were supposed to. You're trying to be a good person. We're all trying to be good people. We're all trying to do what we can do to not fuck up the world more. And the fact that you're suddenly betrayed, and betrayed in a way which is, you're expendable, your very mortality is expendable. The healthcare system has been playing this covert game with eugenics for a long time. The healthcare system has promulgated that. You have medical personnel who are incompetent. I had a friend who wasn't diagnosed soon enough with cancer, and Christmas and Valentine's Day, she's dead. So, you have these judgments made upon our lives in a way which does not encourage a peaceful population. So you have all these ways of dividing us and causing these frictive measures, is a kind of a 3-card Monty going on over these people who are trying to profit off of ignorance, trying to profit off of medications. People run to the doctor. There's information which is not available without going behind paywalls, or is not available even in this country. There's misinformation which is promulgated because it serves a profit purpose somewhere down the road. So our situation with healthcare is not about necessarily living a productive, long, and healthy life. It's about being a manipulated pawn that is based to some extent, on who's your daddy and what's your bank account.
You think it's because these people treat us this way because that's just the way the system that they inherited, and they can't think the way beyond that? What do you think the problem is? The politicians are stupid, or what?
What we have is global international investing. You don't have a drug manufacturer that just has a single country location now. This idea of countries now is starting to, there are a lot of people who identify very strongly with their country and their culture, but when it comes to these corporations, they're not based in that fashion. So you have a frictive element happening between people who view the world in terms of, well, let's get this product over here and then process it over there. And then we sell it for this amount here, and it's this amount there, and it's tramadol over here, and you can't get it over here. And so what you have is a bunch of people who are trying to put food in their kitchens too, I guess. I guess they have a lot of it. I don't know if they're buying milk or if their help is buying milk. But you have these people who have detached themselves from their interconnectedness with regular working people. That's a class stratification. And so
Yeah.
because of the fact that, you have a situation where you're adding more and more people to the pariah class. Now they're added to the pariah class because, maybe they can't afford the kind of food that's going to keep them healthy. A lot of the food now is straight up poison, right? It's just poison. You just know that you can't take a certain amount of this. And that information about, how much can you take without messing yourself up, causing yourself neuro damage, causing yourself all these other kinds of health issues has not been connected. I mean, I worked at a school, and the kids who got free and reduced lunch, they got commodities. Now, once or twice I didn't bring lunch, and I bought their lunch for myself. And it was basically white bread with white bread over some of it that was ground up that was supposed to pass as a protein source. It was disgusting. I ended up feeding most of it to the crow, who kept me company at lunch and who was very happy of it. It was almost completely unedible. So this is what is being fed to kids. And then, of course, because it's bad for their bodies, then they get sick, then they go need drugs, then you're on this arubis of trying to keep yourself alive, and you're stressed because you don't have much money. So you don't have the ability to fight. You don't have the ability to care for yourself. Self-care is considered to be a woo-woo sort of thing of the bougies, and anybody is capable of things to make it so that you don't make yourself sick. It almost, to me, in a certain kind of way, I had the opportunity to watch television commercials, which I don't do. It was food, medicine, food, medicine, side effect, side effect, side effect, side effect. So you have a complete system engagement here, and it requires mindfulness and work. And a lot of people don't want to be mindful, and they don't want to work. They want a pretzel, right? Here's a hot pretzel, and they want a hot pretzel, and they don't think about, the Roundup that's in the wheat, that's in the flour, that's in the pretzel that you're taking into your body, right? Over and over again. It's a lot of work. People don't want to do that. They want to go to the store. They want to buy healthy food. They want to take their paycheck that they work so hard for and be able to feed their families with it, right? And if that means that the kids eat macaroni and cheese 5 times a week, well, that's what you can afford. And so then you become another pawn or little guy with the spear who's meant to fall on the field. And when people object to that, then you start to see stuff like, people growing gardens, kitchen gardens. And this has become a movement which is very interesting in its development regarding kitchen gardens. There's a guy in LA called the Gangster Gardener who's trying to get people to understand that in a teeny tiny itty bitty little space, you can still grow something that you can eat, which is going to be better for you than something that you get that's, processed with a zillion mold retardants in it so that you can have oregano, right? And, if there's a game that's so involved and so deadly that you decide that maybe you cannot afford to play it, then the work is on you. You're not going to get a doctor who says, oh yeah, there's been a lot of research in Sweden regarding the effects of B vitamin on mental health. Why don't you go that way? No, they're going to say, hey, take this, take this, take this, take this. The idea of having self-agency regarding your health is not something that's been encouraged to any of us along the way. So as a disabled person who talks to a lot of disabled people and who sees with COVID being difficult, but nonetheless who sees how people are handling this in the real, in addition to complete and total mortal terror, there has also been a divisiveness among us all. so that it becomes difficult for people to share knowledge, or what now I guess they're calling life hacks for things. And, in some cases there's, somebody who takes echinacea might get rid of a cold, but it's not necessarily going to help you when your system shuts down. So this idea of maintenance, changing the oil in your engine and taking care of your body is something that is not given to little kids as a life path. Oh yeah, and
I wonder to what degree, though, something like people taking healthcare in their own hands, like how feasible that is. I just think about like various things in my life. For example, I mean, I used to be morbidly obese, but I was able to lose weight because I had the education and the leisure to sort of figure out, the right way to eat, the right way to cook, right way to exercise. I have a friend who went to nursing school, and he said that he was shocked when these students, like these are college students, they didn't know how to read a nutrition label, right? And even after going through the class, they still had difficulties understanding what all of that meant. And as much as people hate things like a tax or something on like junk food or whatever, in some ways, like I feel like you absolutely need, on the one hand, an incentive for people personally to not engage in bad habits. And also there needs to be some kind of punishment for companies that do produce like the worst and cheapest food possible. Like, something like hydrogenated fats. There's literally no justification for the government to allow hydrogenated fats to be put into any kind of food.
Well, they have to follow the tobacco model.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
This product, and in big bold letters. Oftentimes, and I work in the grocery industry for half of my adult life. I'm 56. I've worked since 6 years old, so half a fucking century. You have to put on, how many times have you seen a bag of something or a bottle of something that'll say, 75 calories per serving. And then it'll say 27 servings per bottle or something. Mm-hmm. So that whole, instead of putting all of the calories, let's say it's 1,800 on the bottle or whatever it might be, they put the smallest serving. So if you drink a thimble full of this shit, you're only going to get 75 calories, but there are 30 thimblefuls in there. And mm-hmm. This is one of the sly ways they do that. I just wanted to, if I could, though, Alex, I want to follow up on a point that Susie made, and in general about how economic status affects the way people get healthcare. And it's related to my injury. When I got injured this last time in January, they don't send you to a real doctor. Here in Austin, there are several major healthcare outfits, other than Blue Cross and United Health, which are big insurance companies. There's the St. David's Medical Care System, and then there's Austin Regional Clinics, which are the two biggest ones where you go if you have a hernia or you just go for your annual physical. But poor people can't do that if they don't get insurance. So where they go is they go to what are known as MIC doctors or doc in the boxes, which are it's something that'll have something like Shiny Way Healthcare, where you go in, and these are filled with doctors who are, in a graduating class of 400 doctors. They're the bottom 30 doctors. They're the people who don't get the MDs. They're just DOs, and they barely make it. So I went there 3 times in January before the company told me that they weren't going to pay for it. When I went the third time, and because when they drop your drawers and they stick the finger in your sack and they tell you to turn your head and cough, and they get, you can feel there's a golf ball sized lump in my right groin. I got there the third time, and this was just a day or two before I found out that they were not going to pay for it. The young lady who's a doctor, she was actually quite intelligent, more so than many of them I've dealt with over the years, because all companies use these doc in the boxes for workplace injuries. She says to me, "So, Mr. Schneider, did you get your MRI?" I said, "MRI? What are you talking about?" She said, "Oh, well, we ordered an MRI after your first visit that you be sent to get an MRI so that there's proof that you have an injury." I said, "I had no idea about that." So I called up the company, because my employer uses a third-party company to basically do their dirty work. And I called this up, and I spoke to the nurse was managing my quote unquote case. And I said, what's this about me being supposed to get an MRI? She said, oh, well, we hadn't determined whether you needed one. I said, the doc in the box, the bottom of the barrel doctors on the first trip deemed it necessary or at least advisable to get this, and you're denying that. So you have the employers, just like with when I was a whistleblower, you have employers sending you to the worst doctors, and even the rare times these worst doctors do something good, they will not listen to them. And so you have people who are not in the medical profession, who are just in the profession for money, determining whether you can get health care. Now, you might say, well, it's a hernia, it's not life and death, but it can become life and death. There's such a thing known as a strangulated hernia. And Mike, if the colon leaks out too far and the muscle wall that it's leaking through, somehow you twist one way or the other, you can die from the reabsorption of the feces that goes in, and assorted other things, blood flow, and you can't. I mean, it's rare. It's maybe 1 in 1,000 people who get a hernia get to that point. But these are people who are so soulless that they are willing to just. I mean, it doesn't matter to them. All they care about is making their bonuses, making their goals, getting paid. And I'm sure my guess is that these companies that are the third party people hired by companies like my employer probably get paid by the percentage of cases that they deny. I'm 90% sure of that. But what we really need is, people talk about government, and they were talking about the death panels and whatnot. I'd much rather go before an impartial government panel of national experts that could be set up. That if I am injured, or whether it's going back to the similar thing with whistleblowers, you go to them, and they should be able to determine he needs this health care. He got injured because of your negligence. End of story. You can't have companies, corporations especially, police themselves. It will always be bad. It will always be dependent upon money, and will always mean that the people most in need will be the ones that suffer the most.
Yep. You need regulation.
Like, if you think about, what is the function of an insurance company? It literally has only one role, which is to make sure that providers get paid, right? But, if that's your only role, the other part of it, right, is by any means necessary. And this might be like a wider kind of, I guess, cultural critique, cultural comment, but I just noticed how, back to what Dan was saying about, these doctors that either don't really know what they're doing, or just not very curious. I remember when I was in high school, just being around kids who, a lot of them, they said they wanted to become doctors, and many of them, at least the Russian ones, with the time and means to do so, they end up going to college, and they ended up probably going to pre-med or some other similar track. I remember when all of them were saying that they wanted to be doctors, and I was like 16 at the time, and it made me kind of nervous, because I remember trying to talk to these kids about the world, about, I don't know, books, about whatever, and there was just literally no curiosity whatsoever, right, about anything in their lives, about anything in the outside world. And it was very obvious that the only reason they're going into this profession is because it's a well compensated profession with tons of social stature, right? I think it's pretty telling that if you were to ask them, why do you want to be doctors, they would say, I want to help people, but there's a reason why they're not going to become nurses, right? And instead they all went to the highest kind of social status profession. But I don't really know a way to change that, right? I think it's just kind of expected that the kind of generic mainstream doctor is just always going to be very, very not curious. I remember when I was in my early 20s, I got hospitalized because I was taking a nutritional supplement, like a daily supplement, and they had an ingredient there that sent me to the hospital. And the doctor that saw me, because she couldn't figure out what was going on, she just insisted that I was in the hospital because I was a vegetarian at the time, which is just it's just a completely insane thing to say. And the only reason you would say it is because you need to have an answer. B, if you have this kind of social status, you have to be able to produce an answer, right? So you produce something that is just completely brain dead, hoping that, people don't notice. And I'm sure, many vegetarians in that situation, they would be like, oh, really? Okay, sorry, I guess I'm going to stop, right? So that's what I've noticed. Just kind of growing up, right? This kind of total, it's the wrong people that get funneled into these professions. Susie, you wanted to say something? I saw you. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. Addressing Dan's point and also your point about the government issue. Now, I got a letter one time that said, yes, we see you're disabled, but we don't think you're disabled enough for services. And that was made by a government panel. Now, so you're not going to necessarily, if you put things on a government issue, I would recommend that you go visit your local driver's license place, because that's who's going to be sitting at the desk for everything else as well. And, the issue that you mentioned, Alex, regarding self-care, how it's not taught, how we've become away from that. I don't mean to disparage Dan's industry, because it's kept him with us all this time. However, the grocery store, the food production industry, the food pharma military complex, as it were, is not necessarily concerned with our well-being. The medical establishment might not necessarily be concerned with our well-being. They're concerned about us behaving ourselves and not causing problems. And what we've seen in the past year, socially here, is that you have people who are not willing to be demure anymore. Disabled people are supposed to be demure. If you're a good worker and a good Joe, you're supposed to be demure. You're supposed to just mind your business and come home and say, what's for dinner, dear? And this is an idea of American life which is outdated and is causing far more damage than it's allowing us, then the myth and the promises that it's allowing us to have has been proven repeatedly to be a myth. It's a lie. And people don't necessarily want to stop believing in Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or any of their other mythic structures. And when their mythic structures start to show that they're not particularly well constructed, then you have these problems where you have lots and lots of people who are saying, hey, wait a minute. Now, when we had disabled people who were protesting, we had cops pulling people out of chairs. We had people who were being killed by police for being disabled. And that's not hard to research. There's some evidence of the guy in New York who was killed, this cigarette person. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. I apologize to his survivors and all concerned people.
Yeah, Eric Garner. Eric Garner.
Yeah. All right. There was ample evidence to indicate that he was a disabled person, and that how many of the people who we have who are homeless are also people who were cast out of living situations where they could have somewhat of a normative life, but also have a safe place to go, someplace who would know when they were having a bad day, somebody who would be able to assist them with, assisted living sorts of situations. Those were shuttered. They're now privatized. There's issues with how.
Susie, if I could just say, you are old enough like me to remember Geraldo Rivera, probably, when he did that show on Willowbrook at the sanitarium back in the 70s. That was one of the inspirations for
No.
But it
No.
but it was closed down, and people who years ago were able to get mental health care were just turned out onto the streets. And I know Bruce, with the mental health care issue, he can probably talk about the way the mentally ill have been treated.
Yeah, that's a whole different that's captured my attention. How when I was thrown into the mental health system, how society views people with mental illness. It really I resorted to religious slander. I was so angry at my psychiatrist. I've mellowed and tried to work in the system. Now I found something that's a really beautiful program that was created by a guy named George Fairweather, and I haven't drank the Kool-Aid with him, but he
Good.
really had a lot of compassion for people with mental illness and really understood it and did something about it. And he created this program, and I'm very lucky to be part of it because, as it was, the psychiatrists, they love to get in and give you a diagnosis, but then once they got you taking their meds, your life is out the window with them, and you try to compete with them and fight back against them, but they don't want none of that because then you're a radical and a rabble rouser, and they have ways of dealing with that. And the mentally ill are blamed. It's just routinely walked all over, and most of the people in the system cannot fight back. I'm trying to fight back, and I don't want to lose my job or anything for being a rabble rouser, but I fight back in subtle ways. And the guy that invented that program that I talked about, he was a fighter too. And most of the people that employ me are fighters, so they will pay my paycheck, even though and I don't really have a radar about how really people view me, if I'm rubbing people the wrong way or not. I don't know, but I am all for understanding people with mental illness. My opinion is people make mistakes. They're either tricked by other people or they make mistakes. They play with their mind to the extent that they lose control of their life. Once that happens, the doctors want to keep you that way, keep you in their hands for the rest of your life. It's a hard thing to fight back from, but it can be done, and people are doing it all the time with the company I work with. But the doctors are so tied in the medication. There's just a whole lot of if they actually cared and stuck their necks out for their patient and really listened to them, that a lot of these issues people have are resolvable, and people realize they made a mistake in their thinking and they tried something, they took a risk, or they engaged in risky behavior. They made mistakes. I believe you can correct all that. That's just my opinion. But doctors are so tied into this chemical imbalance idea that they think you're permanently disabled. And I've had experience enough with recovery that I don't buy it. I don't believe it that anybody's beyond recovery. Even the worst people I've seen. I was one of the worst. I allowed myself to get really bad just because I was kind of experimenting with drugs and experimenting with my psyche. We really wanted to push limits. I've been willing to pay the price for things I did, but to say that I'm permanently damaged good, I just don't accept that.
Bruce, you mentioned in your novel, this idea that a lot of these doctors, right? You feel like there's no, or rather, the narrator feels like there's no actual compassion, right? There needs to be like a different kind of model. So when you're talking about like a new way of doing things, do you just mean like getting like mental health care physicians like off of the prescription drug model and more into things like, I don't know, like talk therapy, or what do you mean exactly? Like
Yeah, teach them.
what would an ideal kind of system look like for you in that way?
Well, for me, I think everybody comes to a point in their life where they have to wean themselves off their parents. And the doctor was maybe trying to do that with me. He did it very abruptly and very coldly. I think there's nicer ways to subtly make that change where somebody becomes less dependent on their parents and more dependent upon their coworkers and their friends and their wife or husband. I think there's ways to do that, but the doctors don't have that particular skill or that curiosity. They're much more comfortable. It's much easier for them to just write out the prescription. These meds are powerful, and they will make you more malleable and easier to deal with. But the problem that's really there, I think, is confused thinking, and I think you can straighten the paths, but the doctors do not take that investment. But some of the workers, the nurses, and the staff at certain organizations do take that extra step, and that's what has helped me and given me a mind that I'm okay with. The doctors never could have done that. They were just pushing meds, and yet they're the ones that make all the money. My doctor once sat me down in his office and said, "I'm going to prescribe a new med to you, Bruce, because my daughter wants to go to college, and I got to figure out a way how to earn more money." He told me that. That's a lot of tact, pal. That's a lot of tact. That's a lot of caring. The doctors, they believe they made it through med school. They have a rigorous training. They do. And they take on responsibility. Nobody wanted to deal with me. They were at least there to deal with me at all, much as it lacked, but it could be a lot better.
What?
Something to say with you, Alex. You brought up the point that curiosity is a lost idea now, a lost phenomenon, and I have been concerned with that because I don't see the younger generation really as curious people. They just want to make their money, they want to get their job, and they don't have a curiosity, a natural sense of helping their fellow man or curious about somebody else's life. People are not reading. As writers, we all want people to read us. And, one of my concerns is that it's the closing of American minds, and maybe not just America, maybe globally. The closing of the mind. Whatever happened to free thinking and education, all those things, that's really what rankles my soul almost as much as the mental health system, is what happened to people, what happened to curiosity, what happened to nobility of heart, all those values. What happened to that? Susie.
Called standardized testing, baby.
Yeah.
Alex, if I could just pick up on a point that Susie had made about the grocery business, and I'll slag on that business as much as any other business. There's the old saying that capitalist knows the price of everything but the value of nothing, and that it's equally true in the grocery business. And there's 2 or 3 points that I could just make that touch on healthcare in terms of how we giving people nutritious food that could prevent further problems. One of the things is organic foods. Organic is one of the biggest scams going because the FDA, for example, has no definition of what organic is. It'll have on its website, it'll have a few weasel words here or there in a constantly evolving paragraph, but there is no definition of it. So I always tell people who come to me, I said, look for locally grown foods. Because if you go to a local food market, like every Saturday here in the town that I live in, there's a local food market that you can get organic beef if you want. You can get locally grown vegetable, because a locally grown vegetable is likely going to be, you're going to be able to research where it's coming from much more easily than something that's so-called organic from Chile or from California if you're living here in Texas. So that's number one. Number two is that the way that a grocery store is set up is there's something called service contracts, is that every inch of a store's shelving space is paid for by the products that are put there. So it's not customer based. 35 years ago when I got, almost 40 years ago when I got into this business, if people wanted to have Limburger cheese and we didn't carry it normally, I had an ability running a dairy department that I could go to an outside vendor and say, look, a lot of the German people here want Limburger cheese. Let's bring in some Limburger cheese. And we could sell things that way. Now, there is tremendous waste because company A wants to put on their shitty little sugar-filled yogurts for 6 feet there, and they want to have it underneath the Yoplait yogurt so it will sell better. And whether it sells or not, if it's overpriced, it's going to be there until we end up throwing it away. In France, for example, they don't have that problem because they do something very intelligent that in the U.S. we don't do. We do a lot of things dumb in U.S. grocery business. For example, we're the only country in the fucking world that takes raw eggs and dips them in vats to remove the natural vaginal juices from the chicken mother that acts as a natural protectant to the egg. So that's why eggs, for example, in the U.S. are refrigerated. We don't irradiate milk that could last for 6 months. We throw away God knows how much milk in this country because we refrigerate it right away instead of irradiating it, which will lose about 2 to 3% of the vitamin content, but it'll last for a year and a half or more if you want. But
isn't that more so because of like the ultra pasteurization? Like if you, for example, destroy all the bacteria in a milk, that also, gives you an opportunity for, a bad bacteria to colonize it. Whereas, in other countries, you could have milks that eventually just turn into yogurt naturally. You know what I mean? Like, is it a similar kind of thing or what?
Well, as far as I know with the milk, we're right next door to Mexico, and there are people who have lived in what's called the valley, down the Rio Grande Valley, that do sometimes get their milk from across the border because it's cheaper and lasts longer. So they've never had any issues with it. But the thing with the eggs is just mindless. But getting back to France, France has a law that says if 7 days out from the date of expiration, the companies have to pull those products from the shelves. And by the 5th day out, they have to legally get it to a homeless shelter or a food bank so that it isn't wasted. We don't do that. For example, my company will pull something 5 days out, and within 2 or 3 days, if it hasn't sold the last day or two, it's not going to sell. But France mandates that they do that so that the food, while it's still in date, gets to the people who need it the most in that country. And one other thing that I wanted to bring up is the god-awful subsidies that we give to bad product. We subsidize the beef industry and we subsidize the corn industry. Corn sugar, corn syrup is in so many products it shouldn't be in. You can talk about all of these, non-organic, non-natural products that are in like frozen foods, but they are minuscule compared to all the things that you wouldn't think has sugar in it, but has corn syrup in it. And we subsidize this, which we know is bad for you, which causes obesity, which leads to diabetes, which leads to billions of dollars in future medical care costs, and even more so beef. Beef 100 years ago, when Upton Sinclair was doing the jungle and stuff, was actually fairly healthy because the cows, they were not as fatty as they are. They weren't factory farmed. These were free range cows. Now we have beef that is subsidized. If you removed all of the federal government subsidies from beef, a Big Mac would cost about $22 to $25, depending where you are. We are subsidizing food to cost less, the bad food to cost less, rather than subsidizing some of these locally grown produce products with the stuff that is much healthier. So, and the reason we're doing that is because these companies, the companies that Monsanto and these companies that the big beef producers and the big corn producers were entrenched as basically monopolies, or at least oligopolies, that dominated the market before we knew a lot of this stuff in the 50s and 60s and 70s, when a lot of this information came out about how bad these products were for you and were swept away like the cigarette companies did. And so we are literally funding future generations' medical problems.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Lots of stupidity out there.
Yeah, I mean, people have like forgotten the fact that, just human behavior, right? Like if you just think of people, as just kind of, probabilistic actors, right? Everything being a kind of like probability space. If you don't load the die appropriately, you're going to keep getting the outcomes, right, that you don't want. Like if you're saying that obesity is a huge problem, and of course in the United States it is, can you really eliminate it if, the cheap, like food is not only so cheap, but it's the worst food that is cheap, right? You could, go to a store and you could get, very sugary drinks that are just, the portions are getting bigger and bigger. You can't simply tell people, well, you have to make better choices, right? People making better choices, that's just kind of an idealization of what reality is, right? Reality is everybody is essentially a de facto die. They go through life, rolling in that way, and eventually, the wrong face shows up.
Alex, education. That's what we got to. Educate people, and I think basic human has the pride if they know. I don't think these people know. I don't believe they know. And education.
Yeah, and on some level that is true. Like I to use myself as an example again, when I was 20 and I decided to start losing weight, I remember how shocked I was to learn that I literally, like, I knew nothing about nutrition. I knew nothing about what healthy food, in fact, entailed, despite the fact that, at that point I had already been, I've been writing, I was reading, and I thought of myself as a smart and educated person. But even so, like, here was this very obvious thing, right? How do you eat, right? How do you go through life in a way that's just doable, right? For the long term. I literally didn't know that. So, and then you think of people that have, less education, less leisure, less, natural, inborn, whatever. It's going to be even worse for them. So there's definitely ways to sort of manipulate that a little bit.
I don't believe the average, I think intelligence, people have way overrated themselves. The intelligent ones that have made the mark and made the standard of being intelligent are not that much more superior in intelligence than the person that's considered stupid. The person that's considered stupid for one reason or another just got turned off the education, and they're not that dumb. They're not that dumb. And I think if you reach them, that's my whole thing in the mental health system too, is reach the people where they're at, listen to them and hear them out. And I believe you have to walk a narrow path, and most people don't know how to do that.
Intelligence definitely is not enough for many things. one thing I want to talk about was this kind of the HMO system that we have in place, right? Like Health Maintenance Organization, which is what HMO stands for. So that started in 1973 under Nixon, and I didn't realize though how Orwellian that language really is until I did some research for this conversation. So under Nixon, we had the HMO Act, and that just kind of solidified, right, everything that we already had in place, which was employer-based health insurance. So when I was reading specifically how this is justified, how this is sort of described and explained officially, this is what the Wikipedia entry says for managed care. So first of all, like the term managed care, it sounds very innocuous, right? It's very clearly a euphemism. And managed care means what? Like, what do you mean by management? Management simply refers to price controls, right? How do you make things as cheap as possible, which means how do you exclude as many people as you can from this definition? So this is how managed care is described by the National Library of Medicine. It is intended to reduce unnecessary healthcare costs through a variety of mechanisms, including, so first of all, that first line, right, to reduce unnecessary healthcare costs. How do you define unnecessary, right? It's the way that we might define unnecessary is different from a private insurer, it's different from, you know, a doctor, it's different from the state. Susie mentioned that she's not high enough on the hierarchy of disability to qualify. So if the state says that her managed healthcare is, oh, I think we lost for a second. Anyway, he'll come back. So if Susie says that she's not high enough in that hierarchy for disability, that's not a definition that she would be okay with, right? To her, that's not unnecessary, right? But to this definition, she would be in the category of unnecessary healthcare costs. So these mechanisms are economic incentives for physicians and patients to select less costly forms of care. Again, what we might consider to be less costly in a justifiable sense is different from what other people might consider, right? Programs for reviewing the medical necessity of specific services. Here's an example from my life. When I was under the city insurance plan, it's the best health insurance I've ever had in my life. But although they had dental coverage, one thing they didn't want to cover was I had a tooth that needed to be extracted, and it had to be replaced with an implant, right? In my mid-20s. That wasn't covered because for whatever reason, it was deemed unnecessary. When in fact, if all the literature on this is pretty unequivocal. If you have a tooth that needs extraction and you simply, leave it there as a gap, that's going to cause significant problems to your teeth and your mouth in general down the road. You can't simply not have an implant. You need to have an implant in there. But according to, these cost-cutting measures of managed care, that is considered something that is unnecessary, right? Here's another phrase: increased beneficiary cost sharing. Like, it sounds like we're talking about sharing a fucking plate of spaghetti, right? But what cost sharing means is you, the patient, have to pay more, right? So anyway, all of this like HMO stuff, it's just this kind of, it's euphemistic, it's very Orwellian language, and it's just this kind of, convoluted patchwork to deal with the fact that we don't want to simply say Medicare for all, everybody signs up starting, from birth. And to avoid that eventuality, which, it's going to come one way or another, everything is a fucking patchwork, one after the other. Bill Clinton's omnibus bill from 1993. One thing I did not realize until I did research for the show is, so Medicaid was already in place, right, since 1966. What Bill Clinton did was he forced most states that had Medicaid to get those federal funds. If you're in Medicaid and you die, let's say you're sick or whatever, during treatment you die, most states are actually then in a position to go and seize your assets, right? So unless you have a wife that is, or a husband that's outliving you, they get to seize your assets. Or unless you have a child that's like under the age 25, they get to seize your assets. And the way they justify it is, well, if we paid for their care, right, we have to be able to literally take everything they have in order to pay for it. And, like most people don't even realize that. But like, think about it. Like in this country, they could literally seize everything that you own after you die simply because you were a beneficiary of something that, in the law is written. It's there to actually help you, right? It's paid into by the tax system. It's not supposed to be paid into by your own personal assets simply because you were unlucky enough to die. But, that's a reality for many states still. Thankfully, not in New York State any longer, but, it's still the case in many places. So anyway, I just found that pretty fascinating, right? The way that the HMO system is described officially, it's literal, Orwellian newspeak, right?
Well, if I can just comment, the reason that Nixon did that, it was a compromise because at that time, when it came out, the year before he was running against, what's his name, George McGovern, and George Wallace was also running, I believe, in 72 as a presidential candidate too. Now, if you go back to 1956, Susie had mentioned Ike, Dwight Eisenhower. The 1956 Republican platform was pro-union. It was pro what we would now call Medicare for all. They wanted a national health care system. This was under Dwight Eisenhower, the hero of World War II, the pro-business Republican. In the 50s and the 60s, there was something called liberal republicanism and also Rockefeller Republicans. In 56 and 60, that was on the Republican platform. What happened was Goldwater, the Goldwater Revolution. When Goldwater won the nomination for the Republicans in 64 and got wiped out, conservatives were in a panic. So what they did was they decided to back away from the 30 years when they were basically sort of FDR light. It was agreed, but it was known by Republicans and Democrats at that time that there was something called the Commonweal. But when the right wing took over the Republican Party starting in 64 because they got annihilated, the worst election loss until Reagan beat Mondale 20 years after that. Well, what happened was that split. Nixon came up with his strategy for winning. And Nixon, for all of his flaws, was not a bad domestic president. He actually did support what would now be called Medicare for all. But what part of his compromise in 72 that led to the HMOs was that because the Democrats had been fractured in 68 and because McGovern was running in 72, I believe. It was either 68 or 72, because McGovern and the remnants of what was earlier called Dixiecrats, they were totally against this. This was socialism to them. They pulled this Democratic Southern Democrats actually pulled the Republicans even more farther right. And Nixon basically, the HMOs were the compromise between having full health care that Nixon supported because he was the vice president for Eisenhower. So he supported in the 50s. He supported it as his own presidency. So it actually was the compromise. And it was a bad compromise, but it was better than nothing. Just like 40 years later, Obamacare, which I've been on 2 or 3 times, me and Jessica, was not great, but it was better than nothing. So that's just a little bit of the background there of the HMO idea, which didn't exist in the 50s or 60s. It was basically all or nothing. And that was the compromise position, which of course became eroded year after year as people tried to peck away at that system.
Yeah, and one thing that people don't realize is just how do you get to a point where Republicans have to be FDR light? Well, you have to be FDR light because if FDR suddenly gets all these his 1936 platform finally had black people who they were very skeptical of the Democratic Party. This is true, but they figured even if the Democrats are still as racist as anybody else, we're gonna get something objectively out of this deal, right? We're gonna get a material goods out of an FDR presidency. If you have, all these people voting for this kind of platform, the Democratic Party in that situation, they're going to keep pushing Republicans to the left, right? Now we have the exact opposite since Carter, right? Since Carter, it's the opposite. You have the radical party, which is the Republican Party, the radical right-wingers constantly pulling the Democratic Party to the right, to the right, to the right. And even if technically you could say that, well, in some ways, every, new Democratic president is, a little bit to the left of the previous Democratic president. It really doesn't matter unless, whatever generational catastrophe that you have, whether it's 2008 or coronavirus, if the new gap in society that's created by these catastrophes is not filled by the next president, you're simply going to have more and more of that same right-wing drift. I was saying this before, before Biden got elected, I was saying, watch, when Biden gets in office, many of the same things that Trump was being derided for, Biden himself is going to double down over, right? And people are going to just kind of accept it as normal, right? So, for example, I had a lot of friends who are like, oh, Biden, he's not going to be tough on China, right? That's the new thing, tough on China. Biden gets into office, and what does he do? All those same kind of, Trump policies towards China, they're now going to be left in place because, again, radical right-wing party is going to push everybody in that direction. Israel-Palestine, recently had Tony Blinken, who's the Secretary of State. He tweeted out saying that he does not support the international court's investigation into, Israeli human rights abuses. And it's like, give me a fucking break. Like, this is the kind of thing that Trump was being derided for. And same thing is happening now. And to the extent that Trump was some sort of very, very light populist, right? He actually didn't do anything that was beneficial to anyone. But, some of the stuff that he pushed for, such as let's at least pretend to be for the working class. You have some Republicans now that are, sort of pushing for policies, cynically, as it turns out, but pushing for policies that 8 years ago would have been unthinkable for the Republican Party, right? And again, this is a radical right winger that does that. The radical party is always going to, set the tone for the next 4, 8, 12, 20 years, right? We saw that under FDR, and we've been seeing the same thing under, the glut of right wing Democrats for the last half century now.
In terms of social programs and especially healthcare, Biden is to the right of Nixon 50 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Biden doesn't want Medicare for all. Nixon was for Medicare for all. And like I said, the Republicans and basically the Dixiecrats, they weren't called the Dixiecrats in the 70s, but they exploited basically because of the Southern strategy that Nixon used to win. He basically inherited the Dixiecrats, and one of their key things was being against healthcare. There was many other things they were against, but one of the key things in terms of social programs was to kill the socialist medicine that Nixon was proposing. So in terms of social programs, at least Biden, 50 years later, a Democrat, is to the right of Nixon.
Yeah, I was actually having this argument yesterday with someone that, basically culture war bullshit aside, the most progressive president that we've had since LBJ was Nixon. That's literally true, right? But of course, you could say well, Obama, he supported gay marriage. But again, this is, more culture war stuff. Not that gay marriage isn't a good thing. Obviously it is. But, when it comes to material conditions for the average person, that has not been addressed in any meaningful way for decades now. It's kind of crazy if you think about it that, in many ways, Nixon was to the left of Obama, right? In the same way, though, that, Biden is in some ways to the left of Obama as well. But it's not meaningful enough to bridge this new gap. Coronavirus has made that new gap, right? So is Biden going to do anything that will make people's lives better than pre-2020? If the answer is no, sorry, whether or not you think it's fair, that means 2022 is going to be a washout. 2024 is going to be a washout.
Biden wants to send teachers like Susie back without getting properly vaccinated.
Yeah, and during Trump, they were attacking Trump for opening up the economy prematurely. Biden is doing the same thing when it comes to teaching.
And I'm considered an essential worker, yet I'm not. Grocery workers are not on any list. Now, my company says that once we do get on the list, that they're going to pay employees $100. I think it's the Moderna vaccine that they're going to pay us for. Which, you know, I'll try it. You know, I'll go for it. That, you know, but you know, we're not paid like essential workers. We're not treated like essential workers. Teachers, healthcare workers. You know, but I don't know. Maybe Susie can talk about that.
Well, in Florida, the schools opened back for in-person last August, which is 6 months before even the most nascent vaccines were being given to anybody who wasn't getting it black market, I guess. There's in-person schooling now. These teachers are still not vaccinated. I know teachers who are teaching now, they've had to sit down and be quarantined once, twice, because some kid tested positive. And so, you know, the immediate kids in the class are all sent home for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, they still want to run the standardized tests, which is ludicrous if you're actually trying to get an idea of how the educational system is functioning. The standardized testing fiasco has been going on for a very long time and is accountable for a lot of social ignorance. I taught that test, taught people how to beat that test, or not so much beat it, but score well enough for their purposes. The students are cast into a kind of a social caste system based on their scores. You know, are they low achieving? Are they non-compliant? Are they level 1? Are they this? Are they that? Whatever. And so those things are used, that information is used for funding. All kinds of funding, food funding, program funding, vocational programs funding, acquisition of textbooks, the whole 9 yards. Some schools, districts, I know someone who works in the textbook industry, and some of the school districts are so broke that they're making the middle school math books black and white because they don't want to spend the money on a color textbook. So you have a Gordian's, the knot, the big knot, you know, and one thing leads into another regarding these social programs. Now, the issue with Corona, I mean, I don't remember who is quoted as saying we want them infected. If somebody in the White House, was it Kushner, was it, you know, put the kids in cages for shock value, Miller? You know, I don't have that research in front of me, so I apologize for that. But, you know, if you're sick, you're not as concerned about things. If you're broke and trying to feed your family on whatever it is that you can, and grocery prices are going up, you know, you're buying, as Dan said, into this conglomerate. When there's supply chain shortages, people freak out, you know, the whole toilet paper fiasco, etc. The issue with subsidies of beef is causing the destruction of park systems, which is, of course, causing more ecological collapse, which is going to, of course, cause more snow in Texas, etc. So it's difficult to isolate something in kind of a 19th century way and put it into a kind of a jewel box of consideration, because it's not a jewel box, it's a Pandora's box. And so we have these situations where one thing is leading into another, which is leading into another, which is leading into another, which is causing a lot of anxiety, a lot of social unrest. Well, if you have people fighting against each other, then they can't be necessarily evaluating up. Now, that was Zig Ziglar back in the days of corporate cheerleading sessions that were held en masse, where he told people, do not evaluate up. for some extent, it was meant for your peace of mind, but also because it makes you not easy to manipulate and not easy to be kept compliant. All right. So the issue is, all right, now how are these things cause a failing? As we've been discussing for quite a while now, failure after failure after failure after failure after failure. You know, all these programs are collapsing, infrastructure is collapsing, people are sick, there's job issues, there's supply chain interruptions, there's people who are being fed substandard food so that they're, you know, don't see that the stores look empty. And the whole point is to keep people from panicking. You don't want them to panic. You don't want them to express their agency within whatever limited parameters they may have. Can people be self-determining? Well, you decide what kind of shirt you're going to wear. You decide what kind of toothpaste you're going to buy. You make these personal decisions. And in order to do it economically and mindfully and with a sense of social and global responsibility is not easy. And so there isn't necessarily an easy solution except to start somewhere and don't necessarily give up because of inherent opposition, right? We're all three writers. Bruce was, he left, but you know, he was here, he's a writer too. We have publishing conglomerates to consider. We have the fact that we're here on this forum, you know, which has been made available to us somehow. And this is, we're not having these events at AWP. We're not part of a panel there. So we're aware of the fact that there's systems in place, and we are endeavoring to express our agency, kind of punk rock style, do it yourself. There you go, Dan. In a way that gives us a sense of not being part of the problem, to do an old phrase, and that our efforts to talk with each other, to form some sort of community, even if only for these few hours, is to some extent an effort at a solution, you know, like-mindedness, a sense of connection instead of this increasing sense of isolation. You know, you have these people who are doing all this wild stuff to connect with other people somehow or other. They feel this overwhelming need to connect with other people. Florida was a wonderful example during COVID. New York is locked down. Other places are locked down. What are these people doing? They're taking their clothes off and rubbing up against each other at the beach and at the rivers. And it's Bike Week now in Daytona, which is another super spreader event. I don't know if you've ever been to Bike Week, but it's kind of a monomaniacal Mardi Gras where people sort of walk in a big circle, kind of like those jails where people just walk in a big circle. So, you know, we have this within the realm of possibility, but one of the things that we're not acknowledging is that there's a lot of people, there's a lot of human beings. There's a lot of human beings in the country. There's a lot of human beings on the planet. And we don't tend to think about that in a visceral sense physically until you go into a large crowd and you go, oh man, this is a lot of people. Well, there's, you know, that's just in that location. And if you start to put that globally, you start to see that we've got a lot of people, and it in of itself is unsustainable, and it's causing these problems among us because you have people who are, you know, being cast off into the ice flow by other people for reasons which are mostly mercenary, right? Power, the education system, the testing system, the issue with groceries, et cetera, everything is, you know, been an issue because of the fact that the values are placed on mercantile things, and our values have shifted away from things that are more personally viable for us. We've been kind of programmed to think that the only thing that, it's all about, your family, your family, your family, your family. What if you don't have a family? Or what if you choose not to have a family? Or what if you've been cast out of your family? Or what if you're the only one that's left in your family? Where is your social viability then? Well, okay, so in that paradigm, then you have people who have no value whatsoever.
Alex, Susie had mentioned about choices, and I want to just comment on how choices are limited, and in many ways it's an illusion, especially when it comes to food and healthcare choices. I'll give you just two examples. Suppose that you want to go and buy some product that you think is sustainably farmed and it's from a reputable place and whatnot. You go there and you buy the product, and you see, well, they may source one of their ingredients uses some shady tactics. Maybe it's not particularly healthy. Well, because you need that product or you want that product, you don't have the choice to go to the company and say, well, you should not use, say, something like aspartame or something, because it may be a carcinogen. So you only have to choose. Your only choice is that product or nothing. There's nothing in between. Now, you could make that product yourself, a handmade, but then you also don't have a choice, because let's say Susie has her own garden and it's a mile away from a big factory farm. And that big factory farm uses Monsanto products. And those Monsanto products are some kind of, they maybe use some pesticides, or they use some of their patented, literally patented DNA products for certain things. And so she may be thinking that she's grown this herself in her own garden, but she actually is going to be using the same water table water underneath her land that maybe has had some of those pesticides seep into them and gone from the water table underneath the Monsanto factory farm into her garden. So she may not even knowingly have a choice that the things that she's gardening contain some of these products. And furthermore, some of these big companies like Monsanto, let's say that Susie was growing her own corn and it's downwind from the Monsanto factory farm. Well, the Monsanto people come and they one day walk into her garden when she's not home, she's at school, or she's at a friend's house, and they snip some of her corn, and they determine that she has some of their Monsanto seeds have drifted into her yard, and some of her corn is actually Monsanto patented corn. This has happened in Canada, by the way, in Alberta and in British Columbia. They could sue her and totally wipe her out economically, because their poison product that is patented and protected by the government has gotten into her garden, and they don't pay a price for their inability to control the spreading of their poison. She has to pay the price because the government backs a company that is literally poisoning the people that they are sending food to, which again shifts the health forecast years down the line, because just like in Flint, Michigan with the water, those products that are people like Susie in their own private gardens think that they're consuming good things have been poisoned. And 10 years later, because of that, she develops cervical cancer, or her daughter or a friend's daughter of her has a child that maybe has some malformation due to the consumption of these products. So there is an illusion of choice that undergirds all of this, from the very food we consume all the way down to the illusory choices that we have in healthcare. Things like Bruce, even in mental health care. I'm sure Bruce knows something about that. So I just wanted to bring that point, that there's this whole, it's like the lady from Shanghai, the Orson Welles film at the end, where the guy comes to kill his wife who's been Wells's lover. What's real and what's not. There are 1,200 reflections. Who's the real bad guy here? And that's the way they get away with it, because they set up so many barriers to finding out the truth, and so many straw men that even people, even if the government is actually trying to ferret out corruption, which is a rarity, but even if they are genuinely trying to do, it's almost impossible because of the way these things are set up.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's just to speak more on this idea of choice. It's like, even in, like in general, like if you're trying to make healthy choices, you're still because you're up against, these corporations that are not always doing things in a way that's above board, and also, you're up against other things that are just kind of chance in some ways. You're constantly playing whack-a-mole with new bits of reality that you're discovering. So I recently discovered that hummus, which is usually made from chickpeas, might have highly elevated levels of arsenic, which is a carcinogen. Right. So it's like, well, I've been eating hummus most of my life. Have I been consuming, a carcinogen that is not, easily flushing out of my body? There's one thing. Before that, I learned that brown rice, which is supposed to be healthy, depending on where it's grown, most brown rice, I think, in America is growing around like the Mississippi River region, which means that it has elevated levels of arsenic. So I was able to,
and Alex, some rice companies actually dye their rice brown color.
Exactly.
Think it's brown rice.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, so you think you're making this healthy choice, but you're playing whack-a-mole. So now you find a healthier version of brown rice that has no arsenic. Well, what about this other food? Dan mentioned the fact that cows, they were physically different, right? In terms of being able to be free range cows in the past. They definitely, especially if you go back in the past, where before you even had actual farmland and animals were just kind of running around willy-nilly, very different, obviously, fat profile. But if you're trying to make a good choice and saying, okay, I'm only going to, eat grass-fed, free-range cow meat, well, I was talking to one doctor and she told me that she actually stays away from grass-fed free-range cow meat because in the farms that she's been on, where cows are able to just sort of go anywhere they please, most of the time they would spend, a lot of their time like on the road, where they would end up breathing in tons and tons of heavy metals. And by doing that, like, you're now introducing new things to your body that, although yes, farmed animals are in some ways worse for you, well, they might have lower levels of, some of these heavy metals. So it's always like playing whack-a-mole with like new little discoveries. So, personally, the best thing I can think of is just, try to eat whole foods, but keep in mind that throughout your life, like if you're vigilant, you will be taking things out of rotation that you think are good for you, right? Simply because human knowledge is very limited in that regard. Oh, yeah, go ahead. You don't have to raise your hand, Susie. You could just talk.
Well, I wasn't sure if he was going to light me up or not. First of all, I think it's really, really funny that you gentlemen are telling me, the female face in the square here, about choices. I had to make that joke.
Yeah.
And I can't, in the more abstract plane, I cannot buy into fatalism. And that's probably, dare I say, my own failing. Maybe it's my own neurodivergence issue. And yes, it means that there's a huge revision of expectation. Dan's point about the product, you need a particular product. You need, to get some oil so you can run your gas mower for your yard, which you think you have to have because you have a house and you have to have yards, and you're not really willing to do a permit so that you can grow a garden in your front yard and da-da-da. And yes, well, so all these points about the fact that you do have agency do reinforce the fact that the world is round, and that Newton's law is true, that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And that, you just can't go willy-nilly saying, oh, I'm going to make all of these choices. I would say that you can lift your hand to one thing, and no one can do everything, but everyone can do something, right? There's something. we're writers. We're dedicated to the power of the word. We're dedicated to the life of the mind. We're dedicated to literary history. We're dedicated to research. Our discussion for this afternoon has been both personal experience as well as the fact that we are literate people. We're inconveniently educated to be demure about population control. Not in terms of birth control, which is a separate issue, but I mean controlling the populace. And I would still adamantly suggest that there is a choice, even if it's one choice, one small choice, where you can shine your corner of the world, where you do not necessarily have to be a wholesale begrudging participant in death culture. I had a neighbor one time who was an immigrant from Russia. He got hired to be a coach at a gym. And one of the things, he showed me a bunch of pictures he was sending back to his mother in Russia. And here's this guy, this big, tall dude, standing in the grocery store next to the Oscar Mayer display, pointing to it with a picture for his mother to show her how many choices of sausage that we have, right? Now, that was interesting. And the question is we are now inured to this idea of out of season produce, right? You know, that you're going to go, you want a cantaloupe is out of season in North America, but you're going to go someplace and you're going to get a cantaloupe and you don't really care where it's grown. And so, you know, we've been inured to this idea of things being shipped in, of produce being grown on container ships coming back and forth. And, you know, the more anachronistic idea of, you know, this is out of season, so therefore you're not going to get strawberries. You know, strawberries grow 4 times a year here in Florida, and I guess you can put them on some sort of transport and get them to Bruce in Minnesota, so we can have a Zoom meeting where we have strawberries together and talk about, you know, the flavor of strawberries. But this is a false reality. It's not true to us as human beings. We are not biologically orchestrated so that we can eat meat at every meal. These feasty kind of meals that we had, they were rare. They're not meant to be every day. You're not, knew a guy one time, he said, you're really not supposed to eat any particular meal that's larger than your fist. All right. Well, so we have expectations, and we have, you know, 70 or so years of this kind of enculturated behavior, which is not doing us any good. It shouldn't be that Condé Nast has to run an article about some woman who has a garden on a rooftop in Brooklyn that she does with filtered water and everything, and sells to only the highest restaurants. And so I would reiterate the point that we each can do one small thing at least to say, no, I'm not going to participate in that particular death worshiping ritual. Sorry, I'm out. And that's, I think, something that is not an easy thought to consider, but nonetheless is a thought that we would be well advised to say, what can I do now that's small, that does not contribute to everything else being fucked up?
Well, Susie, you mentioned intersectionality earlier, and 2 points that are good about what you just said regarding seasonal eating is that a good example is year-round grapes. I'm old enough to remember when grapes were in season or out of season, and you'd go 3 or 4 months without a certain food. And the human body evolved to eat seasonally. Just like, for example, you're supposed to have 2 sleep cycles of about 4 hours and a little wake period in between. And that's how our ancestors were. In the same way, when you have anything that you can eat all the time, this is one of the reasons that calories and things like that get out of whack. But intersectionally speaking, is if you're importing grapes from goddamn Chile up here into New York or Minnesota, where Bruce is, and it's the dead of winter, you are exceedingly using a high carbon footprint just to get them so that people can eat in a non-natural way. And this is yet another example of how you have something, the healthcare industry, and which is guided, and before that you have the food industry, that also affects global warming. And I'll give you another perfect example. I mentioned grapes. Look at bananas. When I was a kid in the late 60s, early 70s, there were 5 or 6 different types of bananas out there. There were red bananas. There were purple bananas. There were more than one yellow banana. Bananas we have now are Cavendish. What happened is, in the 70s, a fungus came along and killed all these bananas. Now, the world is dependent 99% plus on Cavendish bananas. If another fungus came and wiped out the Cavendish bananas would be gone. And bananas are a great source of many vitamins, potassium most notably, but a lot of vitamins, even vitamin C. But it's teetering, because if we had a dozen types of strains of bananas, well, if one goes out for a few years, we use another type of banana until we selectively breed fungus-resistant Cavendish bananas. But now what we have is Cavendish bananas get knocked out, bam. And not only does that, if you want to speak intersectionally, not only does that mean that we are eating not as healthy as we could be if we had a variety of bananas, but the whole of Central America's economy, the whole United Fruit Company, where the ugly American stereotype came from, they're dependent. Without Cavendish bananas, those countries would be even more impoverished than they are now. And so this is how all of these things, from healthcare to global warming to international economics, are all tied in. And it's all tied in because people are doing things stupidly, and it's all guided by greed. It's all guided by pelf rather than a currency of something else that are used. But that's me going off again.
Do you guys know about what's been happening with Andrew Cuomo in New York City?
Oh, I don't know, but it's not good.
Yeah,
I'm pretty loyal to Democrats no matter what they do, but
you're pretty what? You're pretty woe Democrats?
Pretty loyal to Democrats no matter what they do, but I don't know the details. It sounds like he did some stuff.
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of telling. Like, this is all related to what we've been talking about with healthcare, and also, how other issues seem to always kind of, push down the most relevant things, or relevant in terms of like what most people want, what most people need in life right now. So, like last year when coronavirus hit New York City. Well, let's start before that. So before coronavirus actually hit, before anybody knew about this, Andrew Cuomo, I believe this was in 2019, governor of New York State, he passed a set of laws that granted immunity to like various like hospitals and like people that are basically like donors, right? Some of his like big time donors come from the healthcare industry, right? New York State obviously has a very kind of large and robust like private healthcare industry. So he passed laws that were granting immunity for kind of all sorts of liabilities, and of course, like most people don't really think about those kinds of things, right? When they pass these kinds of laws, because, in the worst case scenario, you have like a black swan event where everything kind of comes to the fore. But we did not have that black swan event until coronavirus hit. So after coronavirus hit, all these like legal shields that he ended up passing had, like a new kind of like a newfound importance, right? Because suddenly, like for-profit, like these like for-profit institutions such as like old people's homes and so on and so forth. Now they had this kind of incentive to keep as many people that they could in these homes for the sake of just maximizing as much profit as they can out of senior citizens, right? Or out of state funds to the degree that there's like any kind of subsidies.
Reminds me of the old movie, Soylent Green is People. They're gonna end up grinding up the old people and feed them to the poor.
Yeah, and like the crazy thing was so it was March 25th, 2020. So this is after everybody knows about coronavirus. He basically declared that I don't care if he said this like verbatim, I don't care if they tested positive for coronavirus. I don't care whether they're recovering or they're still sick from coronavirus. They still should be allowed back into these homes. There's no logical reason to do so, except, if you have some donors to satisfy that, just like, you have like the airline industry, or you have, the hotel industry that's like taking a beating because people aren't, taking planes, or they're not staying in hotels. You would have had a similar dynamic with these homes, right? Old people don't want to go into homes where they're going to get infected and die. And to artificially keep people in, he said, I don't care about that. I want them back in. And this became a problem because thousands of people died because of this, and he started denying that he was responsible. He had a bunch of aides change the ledgers, right, in terms of how many people officially died in these homes due to coronavirus, and this eventually became this kind of big scandal. What people don't realize is when they report on this is they sort of frame it as, well, Andrew Cuomo just made some sort of like dumb decisions and now we have to live with it. Well, they're not like dumb, irrational decisions. They're rational in the sense that there is a profit motive, right, in terms of his donations, right? You could explain it that way, but most of the reporting on this does not report on that most important angle, right? The only way you could understand why he did what he did is not his bullshit excuses about the CDC guidelines. It has to do with his donors. Just to so Bruce said that he's very loyal to Democrats. I'm not, although I personally have no issue voting for Democrats. I do vote for Democrats and donate to Democrats if I think they're a worthwhile candidate. I didn't think Biden was worthy of that, but Cuomo, who is a Democrat, right, and was supposed to be like a superstar Democrat, his laws were copied verbatim by other Republicans like all around the country. You had like 24 states, right, with Republican governors that verbatim copied these laws, right, that were meant to protect businesses. Of course, they didn't apply just to old people's homes. They sort of were across the board. But here's an example of how Democrats and Republicans are very kind of wedded to each other, right? So forget about our personal loyalties. They are wedded to each other. And today, I think the kind of most unfortunate part of all this is the fact that he has all these sexual harassment allegations now, which are, first of all, to the extent that, any person in power would, hit on their aides or whatever, they should not be allowed to keep their job. I mean, it's an employer-employee relationship abuse, right? But they're very kind of anodyne, right? They're not he talks to people the wrong way, right? Or he touches, a woman's back, or he kisses someone against her consent. Yeah, these are bad things, but he literally killed thousands of people. But all of that reporting now is just completely, he was not demanded to resign over those facts. Now there's demands for resignation over the fact that, he sexually harassed some people. And I feel like he's going to get away with, at least in the public mind, even if he gets prosecuted for this, people are going to forget about the fact that, he is responsible personally for the deaths of thousands, which comes out to like $150 per person, right? In terms of the donations that he received. In exchange for those, he allowed to die for $150 per body. He allowed those people to die, but people are going to forget that. They're going to remember the sexual harassment stuff. And just one more thing, the thing about that is it's a perfect cover because all of last year, people were sucking Andrew Cuomo's dick, right? They were saying how good of a person he was, how great he was with coronavirus. Now he has perfect cover. And all those Democrats that went into the Cuomo bandwagon, they could say, well, we didn't know about the sexual harassment. This is the thing that's so bad. And now they don't even talk about those deaths anymore, which is the only thing that matters.
Well, this is the end game of perception over reality. It started with Camelot and JFK, a Democrat who did a lot of bad things, but going from the taxation rates and whatnot being rising up, or lowering the tax rates for the rich, and it goes through Reaganism. Reagan was appearance is reality. That's all that the Reaganism was about. So of course they're going to be more concerned about that, because quite frankly, other than the AARP, and they would be coming in as late to the equation about these old people dying, you're going to have more people concerned about with the Me Too movement and the harassment, and certainly that's not a good thing. And I agree that the deaths, the needless deaths of thousands of old people is a far worse thing. But look in just the last 5 days, you know what the biggest thing on fucking Twitter is? This dumb twat in Arizona who voted against a $15 minimum wage, that Kirsten Sinema, who's a Democrat, used to be a Green Party operative.
Yeah.
So exactly. Like this, thumbs down. And she's dressed
with a little dance,
and she's dressed like a 14-year-old girl looking to get laid. And this is a 44-year-old woman. And then she had the gall to say, her assistant said, well, you're judging her by her outfit, her actions. No. But again, there were 7 other Democrats who screwed that over. But the biggest thing is the perspective. And I don't give a shit about this woman. And I knew that Joe Biden wasn't going to support. I mean, if you're telling me that Joe Biden as the president couldn't arm with, this is one of the few differences between Democrats and Republicans. I look at them as one big corporate party. But the Republicans, whatever you'll say about Donald Trump, and he's a scumbag, and I'd like to urinate on him. But he doesn't give a fuck. The Republicans have learned over the decades not to give a fuck. They say, we want to fuck the old people, fuck them. And you'll get people. This is why you have those psychopaths who stormed the Capitol, because their inner id is unleashed by these people. But the Democrats worry about these little things. That's the only thing. They'll still take the money. They'll still kill the old people. They'll still rah-rah the police and give to the George Floyd Act. They'll still spend $750 million giving giveaways to cops to kill more black people. But the Democrats care about perception. The Republicans don't give a flying fuck, and that's one of the problems. And that's why this Kirsten Sinema is going like a little fucking little bitch doing that, is dominating. When 2 months, or what is it? What now? Almost a month and a half of Bidenism, and he still hasn't given the $2,000 checks. He still hasn't done a host of the things that he's supposedly promised. The only promise that he's kept is that he said nothing will fundamentally change when he addressed the bankers back in 2016. That's the only promise he's kept. But people don't give a shit about that. They care about this dumb little. I just call her a twat. Call me sexist. She's damning people to poverty because she doesn't want to raise the minimum wage up after however many years it's been. It should actually be closer to $25 an hour if you went back to 1938 and indexed things to inflation. But this is the thing that dominates, because there's now people are outraged because she's in that little Lolita type outfit doing her little curtsy thumbs down. I don't give a fuck about that. That's one thing. I care about it. But go after Biden. This guy, I knew he was a piece of shit. He's just a kinder, gentler Trump. But this is what it's all perception, and this gets back to healthcare. And in a sense, Obamacare was a Band-Aid, but it was the perception that Obama cared when he didn't really give a damn either in many things. But again, I'm getting off topic.
I think Joe Biden might still, like, I think at some point we might still see some sort of like minimum wage bill in these first 2 years. But I think the deeper point is like, well, like, so her like Kristen Sinema's like explanation for this is she had this like, paragraph long word salad as to why she didn't vote for it. She was like, we need to have a debate about this. Like, first of all, what debate are you going to have? Like, the debate that she wants to have is $15 an hour is too much. It's too much.
Republican supported in their state by about 60%. This is one of the things. quote unquote left policies of the past, whether it's Medicare for all, whether it's the Green New Deal, whether it's $15 an hour minimum wage, and a whole host of other things, get 60 to 70%. So why aren't the Democrats, who are supposedly the working class party, supporting this? Why aren't they for Medicare for all? It'll save money. Even right-leaning think tanks admit it will save money. And when we talk Medicare for all, it's not the problems that Bruce was saying with Medicare as he currently has it. This is taking every working person that is legally able to work, a citizen or legal aliens who is able to work, will put into a fund. You will have this massive pool, which will naturally, even if the government wasn't there, which just by virtue of itself will bring down prices. Because if I have cancer, there's going to be 1 million young kids who will be paying for that, and it'll be a nickel a year for them to pay for it, because they're not going to get sick for 20 or 30 years probably. But all of this, again, it's just a big shell game that is being played. But anyway.
The way that I view it is like, we have a 51-50 majority with Kamala Harris in the Senate, right? There's a majority in the House, right? Democratic majority. We know that there's like a half dozen or a dozen policies that can be passed right now. You could have even pushed some of the shit into the COVID relief bill. And we know that if it passes, Democrats, if they in fact desire it, this is why I can't say that I have loyalty to the Democrats. If they desire a forever majority, like forevermore, they could literally have it whenever they want. They could say, like the parliamentarian says, $15 minimum wage, doesn't belong to this bill. Fuck it. Let's overrule that. Let's put that in. You're saying UBI past coronavirus is not supposed to be part of the bill. Fuck it. Let's do $1,000 UBI for the next 2 years, every single month. Medicare for all, fuck it. Let's actually change them. And by the way, to do that is forget about like any new fancy legislation. Just take the Medicare eligibility, drop the age down to age like 1 upon birth, and there you go. Just stuff whatever you want in there. The reason why they don't do it is they fear they don't have the votes. Why don't they have the votes? It's not because they fear having a forever majority. It's because they don't want it, since by having that, they have to forego donors in the future. If they put forward a bill right now, within this bill, we had like a dozen of the best policies that we can imagine, and it's going to secure Democratic majorities forever. What that means is in 2022, you literally will never be able to get corporate donations again. You just can't. Bernie Sanders, when he was running, the only reason he was able to discuss everything that he discussed was every donation that he received was a small dollar donation, right? Everybody else, why aren't people talking about what Bernie Sanders is talking about? It's because they have to get funded by corporate donations. So, and Democrats know this, right? They understand that they will forgo forever, even if in exchange for this forever majority, they will forgo forever corporate donations, and they don't want to disarm it that way. And also in the personal, like material conditions, they don't want to forgo that personally, right? They want to be able to have $100 million net worth like Pelosi, right?
That's why Biden and Obama haven't closed Guantanamo Bay. It takes an executive order. You could close Guantanamo Bay with one swipe of the pen within 48 hours, move those prisoners there to the U.S. They could have done card checks for unions. There's many things that they could have done. But so the whole idea that Biden can't twist the arms to get Joe Manchin or or other people to support minimum wage, or that he couldn't try to ram, at least make a good faith effort to get Medicare for all, is a lot of bullshit. They don't want it. I don't believe for a second that the Democratic National Committee wants Medicare for all. And you want to know why? Let's talk intersectionality again. What do you companies, corporations are more scared of Medicare for all than the $15 minimum wage? You want to know why? Because they know that if the $15 becomes the minimum wage, they can absorb that. But what happens?
And they'll get subsidies too, right? They'll get subsidies.
But what happens if Medicare for all passes? Well, then people are not going to be tied to employers because of their health care. I had a manager at a company I worked for whose wife had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. He couldn't leave that company, even though he was making decent money, for a better job, because he could not. That specific company had health care that suited him. But now, if you detach health care from a company, all of a sudden, you could, if I want to work at a bookstore, I can do that because I have health care. And that will cost corporations far more than the $15 minimum wage, which is why Medicare for all will not happen while you have Democrats and Republicans there. That's why you need ranked choice voting. That's why you need people to vote for third parties. And ranked choice voting is the best wedge that we have currently available to open up the electoral system. Because what happens is, if you have viable third parties, fourth and fifth and sixth parties, you have to necessarily build coalitions. And ranked choice voting will say, if there are 10 candidates and my Democrat is the number 7 candidate to vote for and number 10 is the Republican, well, then you are giving or even if they're only third or fourth, you are opening things up and you are allowing people to vote without saying, well, I'm throwing my vote away for a Republican. I'm throwing my vote away because if I don't vote for the Democrat, the Republicans will take over. So these, again, are these intersectional things, which is a term that's generally used for gender politics, but it affects everything, as I've said, from food production to the Green New Deal to healthcare to these basic political choices. I'm rambling again. Let other people speak.
I wanted to address a phrase which I keep hearing come up, which I consider to be unnerving, which is the idea of nothing will change. Now, you have quite a number of very heavily invested systems in keeping things, the trains running on time, dare I say. And I have a friend who went home when the previous president became elected and refused to leave her house and cut off all contact with basically the outside world. And her point prior to that regarding why she supported other candidates was that she did not want to go to the grocery store and be beset with beggar children trying to steal her purse or her groceries. She saw a Dickensian reality as being imminent. Now, that has been forestalled and is being rather desperately forestalled all over the place. I think that the protests this past summer, and because we're North America, and the women who marched in the cold a couple of winters ago, saw some memory posts of the knitters in their hats, is a refutation of the idea of the trains running on time, that there is a potential Dickensian reality which people have been trying to forestall. And when I say people, I'm thinking vested people. Now, how this trickles down to us is that if you have any money put anywhere in any kind of investment system, any sort of pension system of any kind, anything where you're endeavoring to catch interest off of a savings account or any kind of way, is that you are thus investing in the very system that is colonizing us, as it were. Now, am I a person who hopes for dystopia? No, I'm not a prepper. I'm just a cynic. I spent a lot of time in education, and so you kind of learn to get a gallows sense of humor. Is a self-preservation technique. I think that the chaos that we've seen leaking out of the sides of things is not just a random acne, social acne of irritated membranes, that there's further problems. Alex, I'm getting a zero batteries thing coming up pretty soon. So I'm going to have to say thank you so much for an interesting and enjoyable lunch break. I thought I would give a formal goodbye before my system cuts out here.
All right, well, it was
and
nice
I look forward
talking.
to speaking with everybody.
It was nice talking. Thank you for coming on and making the time. Oh yeah, artist therapy. Yeah. So Bruce, we need you for the next one. So just introduce this idea of like art as therapy. Dan has often spoken negatively against this idea of like people that use art uh, not just for therapy. I mean, because there's nothing really wrong with that, but people that use art for therapy, but then also project that, out into the world without, caring about really the quality of the art itself. Whereas like, I think for great artists, like, art is always kind of therapeutic to begin with, simply because like, especially if you're a great artist that's not accepted, in the world, like we think of people like, people like Melville, right, writing Moby Dick, and his books are all going out of print before he dies. The ability to create something that you consider of lasting value, and knowing that it's of lasting value, in a world that sort of doesn't really want you, right? There's definitely a therapeutic effect there. And I want to talk about a little bit about that. I noticed rereading Bruce Ario's CITYBOY for the second time, and I wish, by the way, that Bruce, you would send me the legendary original version that I haven't read. I only read the latest edit. But even in this edited version, I see, like it's very philosophically rich in the sense that you could like open up to any random page, and you have some commentary there that is like interesting and relevant about cities, about love, but it's all mediated from the perspective of a character that is kind of like slowly losing his mind. So it's an interesting kind of version in the sense that when people discuss something like love, right, there's always like a positive connection there, but as you're reading the text, the word love takes on a slightly sinister edge, since love, like 95% into the book ends with the main character, stripping naked in a like Minnesota skywalk, and just getting arrested for that, right? So I wonder if like maybe Bruce, you could start out with this idea of like artist therapy, maybe how CITYBOY helped you work through some of your issues, and how like like just do you think there's a tension between therapy and art, and do you think it's somewhat helped by actually creating art of value, as opposed to just foisting upon the world your own personal demons, as it were, without necessarily having much to show for it?
Well, writing I have to be honest, writing CITYBOY was therapeutic for me, but what I really wanted to do is create art, create a story, and the stories are art. That's really what I started out to do, is to create a story. And I believe it is a story. It's not a traditional story. But I wanted to create a story that was honest. I believe I had an interesting life. My life took several different kinds of turns. But one of the biggest turns was when, I don't know where you guys are at on this, but I believe I saw an angel. And that changed my life. That changed my life, because I said, this is what I want. This is what I want to pursue. And that's the way it went. Now everybody sees an angel. Not everybody has that kind of experience. Very few people do, in fact. But I thought by telling my story, if anything, people might at least get curious about who God is, and what God really is all about. And but I didn't write CITYBOY to garner sympathy about my life, or consider what a poor guy I was. That was not my goal. Mm-hmm. That was not my goal. My goal was to tell the story honestly, and like you said, the ending is different. It's not necessarily a happy ending. Mm-hmm. I ended up losing a lot. And some of that was just the old age. That's the title, City Boy. I believe you can't remain a boy forever. That's just my opinion. Certain things unless what depends on your definition of a boy, but to be wide-eyed and open to the world, I just couldn't do that anymore. But it had been that way growing up. And so I just wanted to tell a story, let people know. And it was selfish to think that people would be interested in hearing about my story, but I thought it was an interesting story. And I thought people could relate it to their own life. That's the bottom line, is I thought people could, if they were honest, they could relate a lot of what was in the book to their own life. Some things were a little bit different, and some people are focused on that. Like my experience of having a desire for women's nylons. Some people focused on that and said, I could never do that. I would never have that kind of desire. And I don't believe it. I believe, and I've talked to enough guys, and they all seem to have something that really turns them on. And, I thought people could relate to that.
I mean, I think the way that you're characterizing it as selfish, it's selfish in the sense that, there is a kind of like, personal satisfaction there. But, that kind of selfishness is always kind of obviated by the fact that if there's something more to it, right? You said that, it's objectively an interesting text, right? There's a number of inversions there. There's stuff that's unexpected there. That takes that kind of, personal satisfaction and selfishness that you could get out of it into something that the world can use, right? I think, it's
That's
just
my goal. Yeah.
It's justifiable to have like some level of selfishness as an artist, because for the most part, great artists aren't really compensated all that much to begin with. So what, you're going to even take away my personal satisfaction in the interim, right? That's not reasonable, right? That's not reasonable.
Well, I'm just trying to respond to my critics, and some people have told me, you think you're such an interesting person that anybody cares about what your life was about?
The answer is yes.
I think it's really a sad comment. Of course, if I had infinite time, I would like to sit down with everybody on Earth and hear their story. If I had time, I'm interested in people's stories. That's what motivates them, where they got. And sometimes I have to back off if I've heard certain, red flags. But basically, I've heard stories from a wide variety of people, and I like to think that I listen with a non-discriminating attitude and a non-judgmental stance. I'm interested in human nature, and I also, with the caveat that I understand human nature can go awry. Mine kind of did, as you saw in City Boy, and human nature can go awry, and then it's not so interesting. It's more creates more revulsion and more, just get me out of here,
Yeah. Dan, do you have anything you want to add, or?
Well, regarding mental health, the only anecdote I would use is Bruce's book, whether it's used for mental health purposes or helps someone there, it's also a work of art. That's often not the case, though, with artist therapy. And a good example of that is a week or two ago, I was driving home from work and listening to NPR in my rural drive through the hill country. And I heard that the girl who had done the inaugural poem at Biden's election, this young black woman named Amanda Gorman, had struck a multi-million-dollar deal with the Mattel toy company to produce a Barbie doll based on herself, because so many people were so moved by her poem, which is, if you listen to it or read it, it's clearly doggerel. It's bad art. And I don't want to get into philosophically why bad art is a bad thing, but the thing was that, oh, it's going to give young women of color a sense of pride and a sense of well-being that they've never had before. But what they were really trying to do is, that it said, "Are you okay, Bruce?"
Yeah.
Okay. What is really
eating some popcorn.
Oh, what they were really trying to do, though, was create Maya Angelou 2.0, because apparently there was a Maya Angelou Barbie doll until she died a few years ago. And so Amanda Gorman has been groomed now as Maya Angelou 2.0 because her bad art seemingly gives some young women mostly of color, a good feeling. Well, I'm all for people having a good feeling, whether it's people feeling good mentally or physically or whatnot. But I think this is an example where it shows that this supposed artist therapy or art being used therapeutically, whether it's by the young woman herself or other people, can so easily and quickly turn into yet another cash grab. And the very idea that she's going to make millions of dollars selling plastic Barbie dolls of herself because of bad art, because putatively thousands or tens of thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of young women of color are going to find this inspiring. I think the only thing they'll find inspiring is that you can create your own grift and from something like that without really even trying, because I think even in most MFA classrooms, she would probably have been schooled a little bit, or at least I hope so. But anyway, that's my argument. That's my main problem with artist therapy, is that it's fine if you're doing that actually for yourself. If writing, if you have led an Anne, what was the girl who the Nazis, Anne Frank. And if you led an Anne Frank life, or you led a life like Bruce with mental illness dogging you for most of your life, and you want to write about it, that's fine. Anne Frank, there is some literary merit to her book. It's vastly overrated. There is great literary merit to Bruce's book, but there was no literary merit to this young woman's book. And so, color me skeptical.
Yeah. I mean, it's if you think about the way that arts are treated, right? This kind of thing where people just produce content, right? So first of all, like the term that's often used is content, right? If you give poetry to people, like you're just giving them content. And I think this kind of came to a head in some ways. It was kind of like representative. I was watching some YouTube video, and then like some ad came up. And it was like supposed to be some like place for people to showcase their art and to sell it to people. And, it was like kind of framed in this kind of like a social justice kind of vein, where they were like, well, now with coronavirus, it's dangerous, to have like shows, and, the face of art showcases has changed. So, we're going to now do this virtually. Right. So that was the framing. But the way that they phrased it was, the example that they gave was, let's say that you paint people's pets in the style of Van Gogh. Like that's literally like, and then you have like paintings that like, yeah, like you see like people's pets painted in the style of Van Gogh. Like the idea that you could just take a kind of, style, right? You could have like, like some of the wavy forms of Van Gogh, the kind of windswept trees, and you can make like a cat's face windswept. And that's sufficient enough to say that this is in the style, in the vein of, or even, in the same quality, right? In the same communication level as Van Gogh, right? This is kind of where we're heading.
Let me give you a more actual real world example than Amanda Gorman, because most people are not going to be invited to share their so-called art at a presidential inaugural and then be granted with a multi-million-dollar contract from a major corporation. On YouTube, I like to interview sometimes people who have these interesting websites. I recently interviewed this really, and I don't want to fall into the cliche, but there was a young black man who called Tunrific Tariq.
Oh, yeah,
he does some interesting analyses of some cartoons, some I've never heard of, some that are classic cartoons like Charlie Brown, Fat Albert. And he's very on point, and we had a good talk. We talked about some of the criticism people have said from him using the word nigger and whatnot. But just as many YouTube channels are very cynical. There is another YouTube channel that I was watching because you click onto one thing and it leads to another one. And it's a YouTube channel called Thought Slime. And on this channel is this Canadian fellow who's probably in his early to mid 30s. He's kind of portly, not fat, but kind of portly. He's unkempt looking. He looks more unkempt than I do generally. And he's got a beard. And he generally he's a left wing type, and he says he's non-gender binary, although he's married. And he often pours out his own mental ills into the world when he's doing a video about this or that political topic. And 1 out of his 10 videos might have something of some depth to say. Most of the time, it's a lot of self-pitying stuff. Well, I saw a video he did a couple of weeks ago where he comes on, and I don't know if this was a stage video or he actually felt this way, and he comes on and he's talking about his own mental illness and how he's a fraud and this whatnot. Now, there have been some famous YouTubers much more popular than he is. He gets maybe 50 to 200,000 views on his videos, not millions, but there have been some YouTubers who have disappeared and claimed they've had assorted mental issues or harassment issues. He comes on and he does this 20-minute, 25-minute video. The first 15, 20 minutes are him basically just sprawling his mental ills onto the world, how he's a fraud and he's gloomy and whatnot, and how his production value sucks and he doesn't deserve to make a living from this because he's failed at every job that he's had and whatnot. And just when you think that it might be serious and he might actually have mental illness, he ends the video with him a couple of days later saying, everything's fine, I'm this, that, blah, blah. So you don't know whether he really had mental illness or whatnot, but people flooded him with what Jessica will call psychic fuel for people who are manipulators like that. He apparently got a boost to his Patreon site. Mm-hmm. And I just found it to be a very cynical and a very deceptive way to try to, whether it's get money or get huzzas, to do. And I think that's ultimately a smaller version of the Amanda Gorman thing. I don't think I think that's her name, Amanda Gorman. I don't think Amanda Gorman set out to score a multi-million-dollar deal. She's just someone who hit the jackpot. But this fellow, he seemed very cynical and he seemed very deceptive. And I think, and even though I would never have donated him, I don't know if it's a grift or not, but I think cynically it might have been. If you look at it, his website, his YouTube channel is called Thoughts Line. It was 2 or 3 weeks ago. You'll see the video where he's calling himself a fraud. And I think unfortunately, him even doing that video, even if it was real, plays into the idea that the mentally ill are not to be trusted, that the mentally ill are working some kind of a grift, that the mentally ill deserve their thing. And whether he realizes or not, he did a great, great disservice, not just to himself, but to mentally ill people who've suffered like Bruce. And I don't know if he's suffered the way Bruce has suffered. He's certainly not as old. He's half the age of Bruce. But I think a lot of things like that play into that.
I knew my mental illness. I knew my mind was telling lies. Okay? I knew my mind. And I did not want to give that any light. I did not want anybody to know about that stuff. I wanted them to know me and recover. It was kind of tricky because I didn't want the stuff that happened to me, my mental illness, I did not want to give that the time of day. It was worthless. My mind was telling lies to me most of the time. And that's true of most of the people with mental illness. That's why they're mentally ill, is because their minds are telling them lies, worthless stuff. And I kind of rejected going into therapy to uncover. Like I did it. The only reason I went into therapy is so I could get out of that hellhole I was in. And but I didn't see a lot of value in where my mind went. It was hell. And So I kind of have a problem when people with mental illness start talking about their symptoms and what.
Well, but it's also how they do it. You know, when I interviewed you a few years ago for my Biorama, we talked a little bit.
I do talk about some of it. Yeah.
And you just mentioned today about your love of female lingerie, but you're not doing it in a way that's borderline cynical. That you don't know. There's a sincerity in your presentation that's lacking in this guy's video.
Yeah, the reason I talk about any of my ideas are to advance my life and advance other people's lives. Most of that stuff, it's like they want to impress upon the world how bad their mind is, you know, and I don't want to give that the time of day. I don't, when I'm at Tasks Unlimited, my employer, all the people who have mentals, when they start talking about their symptoms, I close off. But if they talk about the job or stuff that has a basis in what the current idea of reality or some semblance of reality is, then I will listen and I will support that. That's just how I've dealt with it. It was hard not to talk about what's going on in your head. But when your head is telling you lies, you quickly realize that you have to get out of that. And a lot of people with mentals just cannot get out of that.
Mm-hmm.
They just cannot.
Well, one thing I'll say, Dan, like whether or not like this guy was doing a grift, like it's actually become a very common thing. Like I've definitely seen videos where like somebody comes on and says like, oh, hey guys, like, you know, I want to keep doing this, but I don't know, it's so hard, or I'm not getting enough views, or there aren't enough people that are donating to me. Like, so maybe I'm going to have to stop, you know, who knows, blah, blah, blah. Then they look all glum. And then of course, like a week passes, all these people donate and you have all these like positive comments, and then they make another video. Oh my God, guys, I was so blown away by the support. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to now stay on and keep working. So, you know, whether or not like they are, you know, being honest at that point, it sort of becomes like a little bit beside the point, because when you have like, you know, all these like material concerns that are tied into it, and you get all this stuff in return, you know, it's hard to disaggregate something like, you know, personal sincerity versus, you know, whether or not this is just a way to make money, right? But you know,
it kind of rankles my soul when people go on and on about their illness and then get recognized as great artists, because I think every mentally ill person, if they're honest, knows that they're not, their minds are not reliable. You know, Peter Cleese, who you guys probably both know, told me, you know, Bruce has a reliable life from an unreliable narrator. And it's hard to be in that position where your mind, because you have to function in society. But I worked like hell to make my mind reliable, to be dependable, and what I could do and what I couldn't do. I worked like hell for that. And when somebody just goes out and just lets it happen and then gets recognized as a great artist, well, that kind of rankles my soul. And I'm not talking about people like James Joyce who went on and on about this and that. I don't think that was mental illness. Mental illness is reality. And when people have it, they're very unreliable people, but you can, if you work on it, become reliable. And so it kind of rankles my soul. I mean, I worked like hell for CITYBOY to make it in reality, you know, what really happened, what's reality. I went in a little bit about some of my symptoms, but some of them were true and in reality, but I didn't talk about the vastness of what my illness was. I steered clear of that because I just don't think there was any value in that.
Yeah, the illness in the book, it really it creeps up on you. You don't really get that sense, in the early childhood when the book opens up, like the first 20% or so. But the lack of reliability, of the mind, it only becomes apparent later, and you never really describe too many situations where, like, oh, this is clearly an unstable person behaving this or that way. A lot of it is very kind of internal, right? So it's a lot of like self-dialogue, which by the time that you get to it, even if a lot of it is like philosophically rich, some of it a good reader would start really wondering about. And to the extent that the book has like a true climax, it really comes like only in the last few pages, right? Where and then the narrator just deals with the situation by saying that this is not something, right, to champion, right? This is not something to feel good about. This is an objective concern, and you do have to train yourself to get out of it in that way.
I hope that came through. When I said I was ready with the city, I found a way to deal with life that my mental illness is not in the forefront. It's more in the back burner. I realize I have capabilities of losing my mind, or whatever you want to say, going off. I realize that it has happened to me, and it was hell. I don't wish that on anybody, and I see little value in those ideas I had. And the psychiatrists kind of agree with me on that. They, I at times I tried to elevate some of my ideas, and the psychiatrist said that sounds a little bit boring to me, or I don't really understand that. I think I really wanted to be an effective person, and mental illness is nowhere. It's nowhere.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Well, if we have nothing else to say, I guess this closes our conversation.
I sure enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it too. Thank you for coming on. This is the first time that we spoke through anything other than email.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice hearing you guys. I did. Dan, always good to see you.
Take care, Bruce.
All right.
Bye.